Hello everyone. This is What If Luffy got all his powers at a young age. Please like and subscribe, 8 likes for next part and enjoy. There is a sea. A sea, several of the Straw Hats questioned. Luffy nodded. There is a sky sea over there and an island on it. He told them. This is hard to take in. Sanji replied. But the log pose is pointing up, isn't it? Robin asked. Nami looked at her and nodded. To tell the truth, I've never been on a sky island. I don't know much about it. Robin told her then. Of course not. Nami yelled. It's impossible. Islands in the sky. The log pose must be broken. I wouldn't say that, Navigator-san. Robin replied. What you should be thinking now is not how to repair that log pose, but rather how to get to the sky. Nami looked at her in bewilderment. If the log pose points somewhere, you'll find an island there. The log pose is the only thing you can rely on completely. If there is a conflict between the log pose and your common sense loses 100% of the time. She continued. But Nami began. Nami? Luffy interrupted. She looked at him. Shanks was on the sky island up there. It definitely exists. Weren't you listening this morning? Everyone looked at him. Shanks was up there once. He continued. With his old Captain Gold Roger. So it definitely exists. Everyone looked at him in shock. So it's true? Robin asked. The Pirate King was the captain of red-haired Shanks. Luffy nodded. Yes. But Shanks was only a cabin boy at the time. He told them. In the next few minutes, Robin proceeded to put back together the skeleton that had fallen on the Going Merry and scared the crap out of the weakling trio, while Usopp and Luffy jumped on the rapidly sinking ship and explored it. When they returned, Luffy jumped on the middle of the ship and opened a large paper. Skype. Nami read and took the map from his hands. Luffy, Usopp and Chopper proceeded to celebrate, which annoyed her. Hey now, it's only a possibility. The world is full of fake maps, you know. She told them. This ruined Chopper's and Usopp's mood, but Luffy was unaffected. Hey. Are you saying Shanks is a liar? Shanks said he was up there, so it must exist. Luffy told her. Maybe he was drunk and he imagined it. Nami replied. Luffy shook his head. The true pirate only drinks after the adventure. He declared and raised his fist in the air. Adventure. Yeah, but how are we going to get up there? Nami asked with a growing twitch. We'll figure something out. He replied. After arguing for a few minutes, the monster trio was put into some kind of weird diving suits made of barrels. They dived. A few minutes later. Someone crashed through the door. Just who are you? Masira yelled. Are you trying to muscle in on my turf? The three looked at him. Oh, a monkey. Luffy announced. Masira stared at him for a moment and then blushed. Do I really look that monkeyed over? He asked. Yeah, just like a monkey. Luffy replied. What kind of conversation is that? Zoro asked with a sweat drop. By the way, who are you? Sanji asked. Oh, how careless of me. Masira replied. But do you really think so? You really have an eye for quality. Hey, we asked who you are. Zoro asked in annoyance. Something crashed, but the four ignored it completely. I'm Masira. The monkey announced. I'm the Salvage King. Really? Luffy asked with stars in his eyes. The other two sweat dropped. I'm Luffy and those are Zoro and Sanji. Luffy announced and pointed at each of them. We've come here from East Blue. Great to meet you. Masira replied and laughed. So, you guys are from East Blue. That's right. Luffy confirmed and laughed. But man, you really look like a monkey. Oh, you're just saying that. Masira told him. Oh, by the way, Monkey-san. Luffy asked. Masira's eyes lightened up from the praise. We'd like to get to the Sky Island. Do you know how to get there? Masira thought for a moment and then nodded. I do. Well I don't, but Cricket-san does. We could go there together. He announced. Yahoo! Luffy shouted and raised both of his hands in the air. Ah, by the way. What's in those bags there? Masira asked and pointed at the 3 bags by the Straw Hat's feet. Ah, the stuff we found on the ship. Luffy replied. Want to see? You've been taking stuff from the ship? Masira asked in a cold, angry voice. Luffy nodded and showed him what was in the bag. But you can have it if you'll really help us. Luffy told him and his anger disappeared instantly. But please let me keep this awesome armor. Luffy pointed at a rusty suit of armor and sword. You know, that's probably worth the most. Masira told him. Luffy pouted. But I want to wear it. Isn't it part of every man's romance to one day wear a suit of armor? He asked. Masira looked struck by his words. Man's romance? He repeated. Luffy nodded. I can't go in the way of a man's romance. Masira replied. Keep the armor. Both of the other Straw Hat sweat dropped. Man's romance. A few minutes later. Luffy walked around in his rusty suit of armor. Masira stood on the railing of the Going Merry. "So you'll help us get there?" Nami asked. Masira nodded. "I must always help a fellow dreamer," he replied and raised his chest. "Just follow my ship and we'll get you to Jaya, where Montling Cricket lives. But first, we must get some supplies. Is there a town around?" Nami asked. Her eye twitched as Luffy walked past her in armor. "There's Mock Town. We can stop there," Masira told her. "Yosh. Let's go to Jaya," Luffy announced and raised the sword high. Masira jumped on his own ship. "Why are you wearing that?" Nami yelled. Luffy raised his visor. "Because it's cool," Luffy replied. Her eyes darkened. "You idiot." Nami yelled and punched him. The armor was already weak and shattered on contact. Luffy angrily pushed the remains of the armor off. "Let's go to the stupid town already, jerks," Luffy shouted. Every straw hat on board cringed at this. Except Robin, who quirked an eyebrow. "Oh shit," thought Usopp. "This is bad." Lack of sleep isn't the only way for Luffy to get in bad mood, thought Sanji. Zoro smirked. Now the witch will think twice before randomly punching people. Luffy stomped off towards the figurehead and sat down on it. They followed Masira's ship. What was that if I may ask?" Robin asked the others after a few moments. "And why is everyone so nervous?" Well, Luffy is in a bad mood now," Usopp stuttered. And that's scary." Chopper nodded. Robin looked at them oddly. "It's all Nami's fault," Zoro told everyone. "What was that?" Nami yelled with a twitch in her eye and a punch ready. "Well, if you wouldn't punch people randomly, we wouldn't have to deal with a pissed-off Luffy today," he replied. "It wasn't random," she yelled. He shook his head. "Maybe not, but to him it was," Zoro replied. "He was being stupid and it irritated me," Nami yelled. "He really likes armors. I don't know why, but he does," Zoro told her. "Plus, even if it was, this was the first stupid thing he did today. He woke us up at 5 in the morning," Nami yelled. Zoro sighed. "You're still on about that?" he asked. She glared at him. "Well," she began. "If I may interject, Navigator-san, Swordsman-san," Robin interrupted. Everyone looked at her. "I agree with Swordsman-san." Nami's face fell, while Zoro smirked. "He might have waken you up for a stupid reason, but what he did afterward wasn't stupid at all," Robin told them. "He called red-haired Shanks, which was a conversation which I think everyone here was interested in, also he took your battle reports, which is a good thing for a captain to do." "Did you hear how he talked to him?" Nami asked her. "Are you telling me that's not stupid, Robin?" Robin shook her head. Red-haired didn't seem to mind. In fact, he even sounded amused by it. She told her. Nami sighed in defeat. "Why are you even so nervous?" Robin then asked. "Yosh. Captain Usopp will explain everything," Usopp announced. Everyone except Robin and Chopper groaned in annoyance, while the other two looked at him. One in awe and the other expectantly. "Luffy is usually in a bad mood when he can't sleep because of nightmares," he started. "Nightmares?" Robin asked. Usopp nodded. "Luffy often has nightmares. I don't know what they're about, but he usually keeps calling our names. Even yours, Robin," Usopp replied. She quirked her eyebrow. "If it gets so bad that he can't sleep anymore, he is in a really bad mood the whole day." He sighed. "The first time this happened was on Barady, back in East Blue," Usopp continued. "A pirate named Don Krieg invaded the restaurant. Luffy barely even acknowledged the guy, but when he interrupted his conversation with Hawkeye's." "Wait, Hawkeye's?" Robin asked wide-eyed. Usopp nodded. "Hawkeyes came to the restaurant. He was chasing Krieg from the Grand Line. Zoro challenged him and lost," he told her. She glanced at Zoro, who looked on the ground. "When that happened and we thought Zoro had died, Luffy went mad and fought him for a while. Then, when he saw that he was alive, he calmed down." Robin looked shocked. "Wait, Captain San fought the greatest swordsman in the world?" she asked. Usopp nodded. Zoro looked at her. "Evenly," he told her. Excuse me?" she stuttered. "They fought evenly. Well, Hawkeyes wasn't really attacking, but he was taking Luffy seriously. When he fought me, he didn't even use his black blade. When he fought Luffy, he had to," he told her. To say that she was shocked was an understatement. "Ahem." Sanji interrupted. Everyone looked at him now. Morimo didn't really see it, but the battle was downright scary. "How so?" Robin asked. He looked at her. "It was crazy. When their swords hit, it was like an explosion happened," Sanji told them. "The windows in front of Barady all shattered and all the weaklings were sent flying away. The ground cracked beneath them and the sky parted above them. Like I said, it was insane." Everyone stared at him in shock. "It's true. Luffy is insanely strong," Usopp told them. "But like I was saying, when Krieg interrupted their conversation, Luffy just slashed him with his sword, He's usually so cheerful and playful, but when that guy interrupted him when he was in a bad mood, he cut him. Just like that. Might have even killed him. And then he scared the crap out of everyone else. I see. Robin answered. But isn't the solution to this simple this time? Everyone looked at her in confusion. Well, Captain San got mad because of the armor, we should tell him we'll get him one when we can. Robin told them. Then she stood up. Where are you going? Zoro asked her. The Captain San. She replied. Everyone looked at her in shock. But he might yell at you. Usopp told her. She smiled and waved her hand in dismissal. She walked up to the figurehead. Captain San. She called. Hey Robin. He asked. What do you want? So you really like armors? She said. He sighed. I've always wanted to wear one. He replied. You know, even if Navigator San hadn't punched it, it would still fall apart soon. She told him. I know. He replied. But I wanted to wear it for as long as I could. We could always buy you some armor if you'd like. She suggested. He sighed. I don't think there are many armor shops anywhere near here. Luffy answered. She turned to leave. But thanks Robin. A few minutes or hours, don't really know, later. We're near Mock Town. Masira yelled from the back of his ship at the Straw Hat ship that was following. Both ships then anchored at the town. Luffy jumped off the ship and turned around. Hey Zoro. He yelled. Want to get a drink? Zoro smirked. Sure, Captain. He replied and jumped off. Might I also come with you, Captain San? Robin asked. Everyone looked at her in confusion since they didn't expect it, but Luffy just grinned. Sure, Robin. He replied. She went after them. Hey guys, no fighting. Don't cause any trouble. Nami yelled. Luffy turned around, shook his head. I'll fight if I feel like it. He answered. He could see Zoro smirk from the corner of his eye. What about supplies? She yelled. He grinned. We'll leave the boring stuff to you guys. Luffy replied. Robin chuckled in amusement as the navigator started to turn red in anger. There's a lot of different people. Luffy started as they walked from the harbor of Mock Town. Seems like a fun little town. Zoro agreed. Robin nodded. This appears to be a pirate town. I'm sure it'll be interesting. She added. Luffy nodded. You bet. He replied as they walked past many different pirates. One had a large halberd in his hand. As they walked down the town, Luffy felt several familiar auras. He tensed up. What's wrong, Luffy? Zoro asked. Luffy sighed. I knew it. As soon as I talked to Whitebeard, I knew what would happen. Luffy lied. They both looked at him oddly, one from each side. Luffy sighed again. Blackbeard is in this town. And since I promised, I can't fight him. He told them. Excuse me, Captain San, but what exactly did Blackbeard do? Robin asked. Luffy looked at her. To me, nothing. Luffy replied. But he nearly killed one of my brother's Nakama. 4th Division Commander Thatch is still fighting for his life. Robin looked at him and tried to say something, but something else got Luffy's attention. An old man fell off his horse in front of them. One of Blackbeard's Nakama. Thought Luffy. Who is that? Robin asked. Luffy shrugged. He fell off. Luffy replied. Even though Luffy hated Blackbeard, his hate didn't really extend all that much to his Nakama, since they had nothing to do with neither the betrayal nor Ace's defeat, since they didn't even have hockey. Yep. Fell right off. Zoro repeated with a sweat drop. The man on the ground, Doc Q grunted as if in pain. He lifted his head and looked straight at Luffy. Hey, good folk. He asked. Could you help me? Zoro and Luffy both sweat dropped. You just don't feel like getting up. Zoro replied in a deadpan expression. The man grunted again. Luffy, get that side. Zoro said. Luffy nodded and they grabbed Doc Q and threw him on the horse. Oh, sorry about that. The man apologized. I'm back up. I was born with a weak body. Be alright. Luffy thought. Now let's go, stronger. Doc Q commanded to his horse. The horse took a step forward and fell forward on the ground. The horse too. Luffy and Zoro yelled. Robin giggled in the background. Then the horse somehow picked himself up. Forgive me for being such a bother. Doc Q replied and offered a basket full of apples. I'd like to repay you with those. Would you like one? Zoro's sweat dropped. Hey, that's way too suspicious. We don't want any. Hurry up and get lost. He said, but Luffy ignored his words and just went ahead and took one of the apples. Ooh, an apple. Luffy said and took a bite. Just as he did that, something exploded in the background. Hey, what happened? A random man asked. Some guys took some apples from some weird guy and as soon as they ate them, all 5 of them exploded. Another replied. Zoro and Robin looked at Luffy, who was munching on an apple. He swallowed and then started laughing, much to their bewilderment. Shishy. It seems I'm really lucky then. He told the man and ate the rest of the apple. The man laughed. Exactly. You picked a dud. Otherwise you'd have died on the first bite. He told them. They walked past him. Zoro sighed. Seriously, Luffy, Zoro commented. Why did you take the apple, Captain-san? Didn't it seem suspicious to you? Robin asked. Luffy waved his hand in dismissal. I'm highly resistant to poison and an explosion wouldn't have killed me. Luffy told her. She shook her head. What about us? Zoro yelled at him. Ah, right. Luffy answered and gained a thoughtful expression. Then he punched his right fist on his left hand. If an explosion did happen, I'd use gear second and punch you away as soon as it happened. Gear second? Robin asked. What's that? Luffy smirked. I use my rubber body to speed up the flow of blood in my body. That makes me much faster. He explained. They looked at him wide-eyed. Seriously? Zoro asked. But you're already fast. Luffy nodded. Yeah, I'm fast enough so that I generally don't need it anymore. At least against anyone in paradise I think. He replied. Soru is more than enough for those. Soru? Robin repeated. Luffy nodded. So, you've heard about it. It's a technique high-ranking marines use. He told her. Ha 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 ha. Someone laughed. They looked up and saw a very muscular man with a golden belt on a rooftop. Another one. Luffy thought. He's at it again. A random citizen asked. This is a fun town. Luffy chirped out and laughed. By the way, where are we heading, Captain-san? Robin asked. Luffy shrugged. Who knows? Luffy answered. Any fun-looking bar. They walked for a few more moments. Luffy noticed the sniper of the Blackbeard pirates on another rooftop. Then he finally saw the bar he was looking for. There. He said and pointed towards a bar which a blonde-haired pirate with a blue captain's coat had just entered. Ah, Bellamy. You're going to be a jerk today, aren't you? Luffy thought in irritation. But then another man gained his attention. It was him. Blackbeard. At the same time as Bellamy entered the bar, Blackbeard exited it. They did not share a glance. Luffy struggled to restrain himself as he walked towards the bar, Blackbeard coming in his direction. Zoro and Robin both noticed this and kept looking at him. Blackbeard and Luffy passed each other. Luffy kept looking into the ground while Blackbeard looked at him in interest. Then, as soon as they were a few feet away from each other, Luffy lost control. For just a second, his right hand blackened. It was like a flick, but the other man noticed it. Blackbeard stopped walking. Luffy stopped too. Luffy looked over his shoulder and saw Blackbeard doing the same, however his expression seemed drastically different to Luffy's. Luffy glared at him, but Blackbeard's eyes were wide. He was sweating. He actually looked frightened. What's going on? Thought both Robin and Zoro, but didn't dare say anything. Damn, I lost control. Thought Luffy as he looked straight into Blackbeard's disbelieving eyes. What overwhelming hockey. Thought Blackbeard. For a moment I thought I felt red-haired's aura. He finally compassed himself and turned around fully. Luffy and his two crew members followed his example. What's your name? Blackbeard asked. Luffy relaxed his posture somewhat. I'm Monkey D. Luffy. He answered. Blackbeard's eyes widened. That's the guy that defeated the Shichibukai crocodile. He thought. But I had no idea he was this powerful. Their bounty? Blackbeard asked after a few moments. 70.000.000, Barry. Luffy answered. I'm sure the new wanted posters will arrive soon. Blackbeard thought. Then his bounty will be at least double that. Your name? Luffy asked, although he already knew the answer. Marshall D. Teach. Blackbeard answered. Luffy nodded. Nice to meet you. He answered. Likewise. Blackbeard replied. They then turned around and headed each into his own direction. Damn. If I knew he had refused a Shichibukai position, I'd fight him right now. Blackbeard thought. But if I attack him while he's considering or he has accepted, the government won't like me too much. He turned his head around and glanced at Luffy, who had just entered the bar, followed by his two crewmates. And if my observation hockey is correct, he's way too strong to fight without knowing for sure. He then walked away. When Luffy entered the bar, followed by Robin and Zoro, the entire place went quiet. Whether it was because of Luffy's commanding aura or because they recognized his face, every person inside ceased their conversation and looked at the new arrival. The three walked towards the counter and sat down, Luffy intentionally sitting near Bellamy. Zoro and Robin sat down to his left. Most of the attention was still on them, but a few of the patrons started talking again. Hey old man, get me a glass of wine. Luffy ordered. Coming right up. The bartender replied. Zoro quirked an eyebrow at this. Luffy, you drink wine? He asked. I drink whatever I feel like. Luffy answered and grinned. Now you guys say what you want. I'll have wine like Captain-san. Robin ordered. I'll have sake. Zoro told him. You're the captain. Bellamy asked mockingly as Luffy got his drink. Luffy took a sip and turned to him. Yep. He replied simply. How could a squirt like you be the captain? Bellamy asked and laughed. His crew laughed alongside him. Zoro and Robin didn't react, but they looked at Luffy, wondering what he'll do. He calmly kept drinking from his glass. After the laughter quieted down, Luffy put down the glass on the counter rather loudly. Bellamy and a few of his men, most notably perhaps Sarquis, tensed up. I haven't heard a complaint yet. Luffy answered in a low tone. Actually, I think my crew was quite happy with me when I defeated Sir Crocodile of the Shichibukai. The bar quieted down immediately. Zoro smirked. You defeat Crocodile? Bellamy asked mockingly and stood up. I've never heard a worse joke. Let me give you one piece of advice, whoever you are. Luffy continued. Underestimating people on the Grand Line will get you killed. Hey, are you threatening me? Bellamy yelled. Luffy picked up his glass again and looked at him. Like I said, it's advice. Luffy replied. This seemed to piss off Bellamy even more. How dare you speak to our captain this way? Someone yelled. The 55.000.000 Berry Super Rookie, Bellamy the hyena. Luffy smirked. Is that supposed to impress me? He asked. He enjoys this way too much. Zoro thought and smirked. Robin started chuckling. Captain San, you're being a bad boy. She said. Luffy's eyes widened and he looked at her in shock. Zoro also stopped smirking and turned in her direction, also shocked by her words. What? She asked, still smiling. Robin. Luffy began. That sounds even worse than bad girl. Way worse. Robin chuckled. That's your punishment for calling me that. She replied. Luffy pouted. Stop ignoring me. Bellamy yelled and tried to punch Luffy, but he caught his fist with his palm. Luffy didn't even bother to face him. Fine. Luffy replied to her and smirked. Have it your way, bad girl. Being ignored again of course completely enraged Bellamy. He stepped back and activated his ability, which caused most of the patrons to run out of the bar. Spring snipe. Bellamy yelled and launched himself at Luffy. Armament. Luffy murmured. Luffy stayed as he was, not moving an inch. As soon as Bellamy's punch hit Luffy, the force of the punch was returned to him several times over and he was blown away, crashing through the wall of the bar and flying through several houses. Zoro's sweat dropped. Was that really necessary, Luffy? He asked. Luffy laughed sheepishly and scratched his head. I might have overdone it. He replied. Might have. Zoro yelled at him with razor-sharp teeth. Robin just stared wide-eyed at the mad-shaped hole in the wall. Somewhere else on the island, Blackbeard stared shocked at an unconscious Bellamy who was embedded into the wall of the house. Back at the bar, Luffy paid for the drinks and the 3 crew members turned to leave. By the way, Luffy. Zoro asked. Who was guy we met in front of the bar earlier? I think that's quite obvious, Swordsman-san. Robin replied. Zoro's eyes widened. Blackbeard? He asked. Luffy nodded. That's him. He replied. But let's forget about him and think about Sky Island now. He raised both of his hands in the sky. Adventure. Everyone turned to leave, but when Robin tried to stand up, Luffy put an arm on her shoulder. You stay. He told her. Everyone looked at him in confusion. Luffy turned around to face them and was now sporting an evil grin. They cringed upon seeing it. It'll be way too easy for them if you come along. Robin chuckled as he waved at them. Have fun, guys. As they left, either muttering curses or sulking, Luffy let himself fall backwards on the grass. When he could no longer hear them, he turned to Robin and smirked. She quirked an eyebrow. Shishishi. This should be priceless. He told her. Again you seem to know something that we don't, Captain San. She replied. He chuckled. I tried to catch a south bird once Luffy began and was then quiet for like a full minute. He spread his limbs over the grass. Well, like I said. He then continued. It should be funny. Shishishishi. You're right, kid. Cricket added, also sporting a grin of his own. Those birds are devilish. She sighed. I hope they aren't in danger. She said. Luffy chuckled again. Nah. Not serious danger anyway. Luffy answered. She shook her head. By the way, Captain San. If you wanted Blackbeard gone so much, why didn't you just provoke him or something? She asked after a moment. Or you could have just attacked him anyway. Who's Blackbeard? Cricket asked as he sat down next to them. He was following their conversation. The traitor. Luffy answered. Blackbeard or Marshal D. Teach was part of Whitebeard's crew, but he betrayed them and nearly killed one of their commanders. He's an Akama-killing bastard, the worst kind of a man you can find on the sea. Cricket's eyes widened. Whitebeard? What do you have to do with Whitebeard, kid? He asked. Luffy looked at him. Both of my brothers are in his crew. He answered, much to Cricket's shock. But even if they weren't, I'd still hate the guy. I can't stand to even be around people like that. He pulled himself up and sat on the grass. I mean, I'd let go of anything else. But a man who kills one of his nakama, who basically put his life and trust into his hands, a man like that deserves to die on the spot. Both of them looked at him with wide eyes, shocked beyond belief at the words that came from his usually cheerful mouth. That's quite shocking to hear from you," Robin told him. He looked at her and sighed. "Nakama aren't supposed to kill each other," he told her. "When you join a pirate crew, you are hunted and hated by the world, so your nakama are often the only people you can turn your back to. To be betrayed by one of them, it's unthinkable." He sighed and fell back on the grass. "I don't know that much about Whitebeard, but I've heard that he has only one ironclad rule. Don't kill your nakama. Whatever the reason," Luffy continued. But there had to be a reason for Blackbeard to betray his crew after years of loyal service. Something that outweighed the risk of betraying Shirohige. He looked at Robin and sighed. "My bet is on a devil fruit. Loja probably. And it has to be very powerful, even among the best of them," Luffy finished. He knew that was correct. Yami Yami no Mi was most likely a Loja, and it had the ability to disable any devil fruit on touch, even Luffy's, which was always on, even in sea stone and water. That's quite an impressive deduction, Captain San," Robin told him. He laughed. "Thanks," he replied. But even if he really wanted the fruit, he could always have stolen it. He didn't need to kill anyone. If he had stolen it, he'd probably get punished, but he'd live. So, I guess he was planning all of this somehow. He sighed again and looked at the ground. "And that's why I fear for Ace," he concluded. "And in only a few weeks you'll see I was right. But I'll prevent the worst. I swear." His arm blackened again. Robin looked at it cautiously. "You're dealing with big shots there, kid," Cricket replied. Luffy nodded. "How strong do you think he is?" Robin asked him. Luffy shrugged. "Seeing as he dared to betray Whitebeard, I'd say he's at least as strong as the average commander, but he could be even stronger," he replied. In all honesty, Luffy didn't know. When he met him in Mocktown, Blackbeard never showed his level of hockey, and Luffy was unable to sense it when they met in Impel Down in his first life. He knew that he had managed to kill his former captain, but he also knew that Whitebeard was by then nearly dead, using most of his hockey and strength just to remain alive, so he was fairly sure that he himself was stronger than Blackbeard as well, since he couldn't imagine Shanks, for example, having too much trouble with Whitebeard in such a state, but Blackbeard nearly died to him. They were silent for a few moments, but then Robin remembered something. "You haven't answered my question, Captain San," she told him. He looked at her. "Why didn't you provoke him or something like that?" He sighed. "When something like this happens, a crew's reputation is at stake. It's their job to deal with a betrayer. It'd be poor honor to do that for them. As much as I was tempted, I couldn't do that," Luffy told her. "Also, I don't break promises." After a few hours, the modifications and repair of the Going Merry were nearly finished. Sanji came running towards the three pirates, seated on or near the tree stump, followed by the rest of their crew members. Zoro carried a southbird in his hands. All of them had plenty of bumps and small cuts on their bodies, but worst of all, following behind them was half the animals of the Joya forest. Luffy pointed at them and fell over, laughing his ass off. When Robin saw the scene, her eyes widened and she failed to suppress her own laughter. Phew. I see what you meant, Captain San." "Hey, stop laughing," Zoro yelled with an angry red face. Shishi. Sorry. Shishi. "Quit that," Nami yelled. Phew. "Sorry, Navigator-san." Then as they reached them, Luffy stood up and released a wave of controlled Conqueror's haki. All the animals following them fell down on the ground. Luffy looked at his crew members for a few moments and then continued laughing. "Stop it," Sanji yelled. "Stop laughing, shitty rubber." Robin, on the other hand, stared at the fallen animals in shock. What did just happen? Was that also haki? To change the direction of the slash. The wave went past Blackbeard, destroying another piece of his raft near him, but leaving him unharmed. Luffy turned to the left and glared at Oj, Blackbeard's sniper, who stood on a piece of the raft, with his gun aiming at him. At least his nakama are loyal, Luffy thought. For now. The sniper shot him several times, preventing him from doing anything for a few moments. Then his bullets ran out. Luffy smirked at him and turned back to Blackbeard, however just as he was about to slash a third time, water exploded beneath them. They were blown into the sky. The four Blackbeard pirates made their way to their captain and together they sat on the biggest piece of wood. "Zahahaha. I'm still alive," Blackbeard yelled. "I'm pretty lucky, aren't I?" The resident champion, Jesus Burgess scowled. "Captain, how can you take this so lightly?" he yelled at his captain. "You were this close to dying and it's all your fault." "Zahahaha. But I'm alive," Blackbeard shouted again. "I guess it wasn't my time to go yet, eh, Oj?" "Exactly." The sniper replied quietly. "Oh, and thanks, Oj," Blackbeard told him. The sniper nodded. "Honestly, Captain," Burgess scolded. "If you knew he could do that, why did we attack him on the sea?" "But I didn't know," Blackbeard replied. "Anyway, forget about it now. We're all fine." Zahahaha. "Whatever." Meanwhile, on the Going Merry, which was sailing towards the sky, Luffy sheathed his sword and clenched both of his fists. He stood on the door of the Going Merry. "Damn," Luffy thought. "I failed. That was my last chance to get rid of him before he got ace. Why didn't I just ignore Whitebeard's request and kill him right there in the town?" He gritted his teeth. When he finally raised his head, he saw both Zoro and Robin staring at him. He hardly even noticed the position the ship is in. Robin thought. This isn't just some policy of his. This seems personal. He took a deep breath and forced a smile on his lips. He looked around and noticed the rest of his nakama, much less calm than the three. "Unfurl the sails," Nami ordered. "This isn't just a column of water. It's the ocean. A vertically flowing current." "Yosh!" Luffy yelled and grinned genuinely now, Blackbeard forgotten for a bit upon seeing the determined navigator. He proceeded to do as she asked. She proceeded to explain some things about the phenomenon, but Luffy just focused on what he was doing. "Who's this ship's navigator?" he heard her say. He grinned. "It's Nami Swan." Sanji sang out with a heart in his eye, but didn't do his noodle dance. That might be a little dangerous to do in such a situation. Nami continued yelling orders as Luffy jumped down from the mast and pushed his hand in the air. To the sky. The next who got up was Robin, who looked around the ship and couldn't believe what she saw for a moment. Then she just smiled. The last to get up were Zoro and Sanji, and that was because they competed who would get up first and kept preventing each other from standing up. "Oh!" Luffy exclaimed and suddenly let go of his two dancing partners. "I hope no one is stupid enough to go swimming here. If you do, you'll fall back down on the Grand Line." Nami's eyes again widened and she took a step back. Luffy looked at her with an annoyed expression. "Really?" he asked her and sighed. Robin chuckled. "Luffy, she started." He put an arm on her mouth. Zoro's eyes widened. "Nami, if you finish that sentence, I'm leaving the next enemy to you," he told her. "Okay." She nodded meekly and he let go of her mouth. Zoro chuckled as she remained quiet. "Hey, don't talk that way to Nami Swan," Sanji yelled at him. Luffy turned to him and looked at him with a confused expression. "What way?" he asked. Sanji glared at him. "Don't order her around," he told him. Luffy blinked a few times. "But I'm the captain. That's what I do," he told him. Sanji opened his mouth to say something, but he closed it. "You're right, Luffy. You're the captain," Zoro told him with a smirk on his face. Sanji glared at him. "You can order us around, especially the Dartbro over here." "Shitty Murimo," Sanji replied. "Shitty cook," Zoro retorted. "You want to fight, stupid swordsman," Sanji yelled and put his face right into Zoro's. "You can't match me, stupid Dartbro," Zoro yelled back, pushing him away. "Shut up," Nami yelled and punched both of them on the head. "Hi, Nami Swan," Sanji replied in his beaten-up state. "Stupid witch," Zoro growled. Robin clapped her hands a few times in applause. "Thank you, Robin," Nami told her and took a small bow. "My pleasure," the archaeologist replied and giggled. Then they suddenly heard a splash. A huge fish rose from the water and jumped right at the Mary to take a bite. "You're third," Luffy announced. Everyone looked at him, wondering what he'd do. Luffy took his right hand to his mouth and bit into the thumb. Then he took a deep breath and blew lots of air into it, and to the surprise and shock of his nakama, the hand grew in size until it was as large as that of a giant. Sanji dropped his cigarette. Luffy then, ignoring his gaping nakama, grabbed the approaching fish by the neck and stopped it. Then he just threw it into the distance. He turned around and saw his still gaping nakama. "Hello," he said and waved the now deflated hand in front of their faces. "What was that, Luffy?" Zoro asked. Luffy smirked proudly. "That's Gear Third," he answered. "Since I'm rubber I can enlarge my bones by putting air into them." "How is that possible?" Usopp asked. Luffy shrugged. "I'm rubber," he answered. Everyone blinked a few times. Then another, but larger fish also tried to attack the Mary, but Luffy just punched it away casually. As the fish flew away, another much smaller fish fell onto the deck. Robin picked it up. "Would you say this is a skyfish?" she asked. The strange fish Norlin mentioned in his journal. Since the sea has no bottom, they must have evolved various adaptations to survive. Luffy walked up to her and took the little fish out of her hands. "Looks tasty," he muttered. He ignored Robin, Zoro and Nami as they talked about the topic further and just handed it to Sanji, who quickly cooked it. Luffy took a bite. "This is so good," he announced. Nami sighed and slapped her head. We weren't done, you know. She told him. Try it. Luffy told her. She took a bite. You're right. She chirped out. It's delicious. I'm glad you like it, Nami-san. Sanji thanked her. Let's eat a big one too. Luffy announced. Sanji shrugged. Just find one. He told him. Luffy turned to Robin and handed her the plate. She looked at him. You caught it, so try it. He told her and grinned. Nami's eyes widened again and she took a step back. You're sharing food. She screeched out. Shishishi. You're so funny, Nami. Luffy told her. She blinked a few times. I'm funny? She asked with a confused expression. Luffy nodded. Nami imitation. He announced. He put his hands in front of him as if trying to push something away and gained a comically shocked expression. He took several steps back. Nami's eye twitched. Oh no. What did you do with Luffy? Luffy exclaimed in a fake Nami voice. Robin nearly spat out the fish she was chewing as she barely contained her laughter. Usopp and Chopper however were already rolling on the floor. Hey. I don't talk that way. Nami yelled and slapped him. Luffy then suddenly sensed a relatively strong aura approach them. He looked into the distance and saw a ship getting destroyed. What is it? Nami asked. Luffy looked at her. Someone is approaching. He told her. In a few moments, a masked man who seemed to ride on top of the cloud sea appeared in front of them. Oh you there? Sanji called. What do you want? I shall reject you. The man declared. He wants a fight. Sanji told them. Zoro took out his katana. Fine by me. He replied. The man then slammed into Sanji, sending him flying into the ground. He jumped up and kicked Zoro, who was just about to slash him. He jumped back in the air and attempted to kick Luffy into the ground, but Luffy sidestepped and avoided him. Armament. Luffy murmured. He stretched out his palm and slapped the man away, sending him flying into the distance. Damn jerk. He muttered and his armament disappeared. Then another man appeared out of the sky. He rode a weird pink bird with purple circles. He wore a shiny silver armor and he had a silver lance as a weapon. Weird night. Luffy thought and grinned. The man landed on the railing of the ship. So it seems you didn't need my help. He said simply. What is going on? Nami asked. She glanced at the two members of the monster trio who laid on the ground. What are you two doing? Don't blame them, Nami. Luffy told her. It's just that the air here is much thinner than down below. Right, now that I think about it, Zoro confirmed. Nami looked at Luffy. How come you aren't affected? She asked. He grinned. Training. He replied. Are you Blue Sea Dwellers? The knight asked. Yes. Luffy answered. Nami looked at him oddly. Blue Sea Dwellers? She asked. Luffy looked at her. This is known as the White Sea and the sea below is known as the Blue Sea. He told her. He looked at the knight. Right. The knight looked at him in surprise. You seem to know some things about this place. He replied. Were you here before? Luffy shook his head. No, but I've heard about it from someone who was. He replied. The knight quirked an eyebrow. Shanks, apprentice of Gold D. Roger. The knight's eyes widened. So you've met him? Luffy asked after seeing his surprised expression. The knight nodded. How's Roger doing? Is he well? The knight asked. Luffy sighed. I'm afraid he's gone. Luffy replied. He became the Pirate King and then he was executed. The man's face fell visibly. That's too bad. He and his band were a good bunch. I'm sorry to hear they're gone. He replied. Oh, but they're not all gone. Luffy told him. He looked up in surprise. The crew also looked at Luffy. Most of them are still alive. But how, Captain San? The government said they were all captured. Robin interrupted. Luffy shook his head. They weren't captured. He told them. Everyone gasped at the revelation. The Pirate King surrendered. Luffy ignored the shocked expressions and continued. Silvers, Rayleigh, Shanks and Buggy all still live. He told them. Nami and Zoro looked at him with wide-eyed expressions. Why you're kidding, right? Nami asked. Luffy looked at her and shook his head. Zoro blinked a few times. Buggy was one of the Pirate King's nakama? He asked after a few moments. Luffy nodded. The cabin boy, like Shanks. He answered. Both of them shook their heads. Every herd has a black sheep. Sanji offered. They both nodded repeatedly. Who's Buggy? Robin asked. Everyone looked at her. An East Blue pirate. Sanji told her. And nobody basically. Somewhere on the Grand Line, a certain red-nosed pirate got the sudden urge to murder someone. Ah, by the way, what's your name? Luffy asked. I'm the Knight of the Sky, Ganfall. And this is my partner Pierre. He replied. So, seeing how you don't need my help, I'll take my leave. Wait. Nami yelled after him. He stopped. What do you mean help? This is a service. He answered. This is a dangerous land. I make my living as a knight for hire. I give this whistle to whoever wants my help, and if you blow it, I come to your aid. I hope this doesn't sound wrong. But for a fee of 5,000,000 extols. The knight added. Everyone's sweat dropped as the fee seemed outrageously high. I think we'd like to take the whistle. Luffy answered. I can't be everywhere at once after all. I see. The knight replied. Here you go. He threw him the whistle and Luffy caught it. Since you told me about Roger's fate, I'll give you one service for free. The knight replied. But every next service will cost 5,000,000 extols. What are you talking about, old man? Sanji asked. What's this extol thing? Anfull gasped and sweated. You mean you didn't come here from High West? He asked. Everyone looked at him oddly. But you must have at least stopped by 1 or 2 islands. Hold on. Nami interrupted. You mean there are other ways to get up here? And what do you mean 1 or 2 islands? There are more of them. You mean that you Ganfull began? We rode the knock upstream. Robin interrupted. His eyes widened again. You mean that monstrous current? He asked. To think that there are still souls brave enough to do that. I knew it wasn't a normal route. Nami cried. She grabbed Luffy's cardigan and shook it. I thought we were going to die. If we had gathered more information, we'd have an easier trip. It's all your fault. But it was fun, wasn't it, Nami? Luffy asked cheerfully. Ganfull resisted the urge to sweat drop. Have you lost any of your crew? He asked. Nope. Luffy replied cheerfully. I see. The knight replied. But the other routes would not have been so merciful. Here you either all die or all survive. After a few more minutes of conversation, the Knight of the Sky left on his bird/horse partner and the Straw Hats continued to their destination. So good. He yelled out. It wasn't an exaggeration. The juice in the melon was really good. Is it really so good? Usopp asked. Luffy nodded and gave it to him. Usopp tried it and confirmed Luffy's words. Luffy looked up to the girl. Could we take a few of those? He asked her. She smiled. Sure, we have a lot here. She replied. But, oh, where are my manners? I'm Conis and this is Sue, a cloud fox. Should you need anything, please let me know. About that. Sanji began. The look in your eyes has pierced my heart. Nami pulled his ear and pulled him away. Oh, Nami Swan, is this jealousy? He asked in his love-dazed state. Humph. You wish. She told him and he deflated and started sulking on the ground. Robin chuckled upon seeing that. He instantly jumped back up. Is perhaps my Robin Chuan jealous? He asked and started twirling around her. Not at all, Cook-san. She's all yours. Fufu. She told him. He deflated again, having been refused by the both of the ladies. Gee. Hopeless dart bro. Zoro muttered. A vein popped on Sanji's head. What was that, Maremo? He replied and stood up. I said you're hopeless, shitty cook. Zoro told him. And then they started fighting. Usopp and Nami sighed, Chopper watched in awe, and Robin ignored them. But then, Luffy started laughing his full-blown laughter. Not his trademark shishishi, but a roaring laugh. Everyone was startled by this and they looked at him. Even the two who were fighting. What's so funny, Luffy? Usopp asked in confusion. Luffy finally stopped then and got up. Shishi. Sorry, it's just that they look like a quarreling couple. Everyone blinked a few times and after a while they were all on the ground, laughing their asses off. Even the stoic Robin had a good laugh and Conis actually joined them. Why you? They both seethed at the same time. Ha. Look, they're totally the same. Usopp told them. I'm not the same as the disgusting Maremo. I'm not the same as the perverted love cook. They both yelled at the same time. See, Usopp's right. Luffy cheerfully replied and fell down laughing, along with the rest of his crew. Luffy both of them muttered darkly and jumped at him, attempting to beat him up. Luffy of course dodged or blocked every move while laughing all the time. Hey guys, stop fighting. Nami yelled after finally picking herself up. Hey Nami. Luffy yelled. Look at this. Everyone looked at him. Stop it, shitty captain. Sanji yelled. Luffy gained an evil grin as he dodged his kick. The two rivals paled upon seeing it. He put both of his hands together with only his index fingers extended and made them almost touch each other. Your cooking is shitty, dart bro. Luffy imitated with his best Zoro voice whilst moving his right index finger. Not as shitty as your swordsmanship, Maremo. Luffy imitated in his Sanji voice whilst moving the left index finger. Then he put the two fingers together, rubbing them against each other while imitating kissing sounds. And everyone was on the ground once again. Ha. Luffy, ha. My stomach. Usopp laughed. The rest weren't much better. The two rivals started attacking more and more furiously and all the while, Luffy was laughing. The least affected was Robin, who, while laughing uncharacteristically long and loud for herself, was still standing. While she didn't have anything against a good laugh, she knew that with their stamina and Luffy's endless supply of immature jokes, this could take a while. So she defused the situation the only way she could think of. Phew. Stop being a bad boy, Captain San. She told them. The reaction was immediate. Everyone quieted down and was gaping at her like a fish in disbelief. Did I hear that right? Nami wondered aloud. Are you feeling sick, Robin? Usopp asked. Doctor. Someone call a doctor. Chopper yelled. Why did Robin Chuan say that? Sanji asked in a puzzled expression. Zoro and Luffy, who had already heard her say that, just stared at her. There was silence for a few moments and then. Shishy. My crew is so funny. Luffy laughed and then took the melon from the ground and started drinking from the straw. Everyone sighed, finally freed from their painful laughter. Hana-san, Hizo. Someone yelled from far away, startling everyone. Hizo, father. Kanis yelled back. Her father was using some sort of device to travel on the sea cloud and Nami noticed it. Hey, what is that thing? The thing he's riding on? She asked. Kanis looked at her. Oh, that's a waiver. Kanis replied and smiled. Waiver? Nami repeated. Hey. I'm sorry. The father yelled. I'm stopping now. And stop he did, right in the nearest tree, while nearly hitting some of the crew. Is everyone okay? He asked. Everyone's sweat dropped. What about you? Zoro yelled. Hey Luffy, didn't you bring something like that from the ocean floor? Nami asked Luffy, who was drinking from his melon. Yes I did. Luffy put the waiver in the same bag as his poor armor. A few minutes, waiver riding and conversations later. They sat down on the sofas, cloud sofas, in the living room of their hosts. Ah, but we're so rude. Luffy suddenly exclaimed while they were relaxing in their seats. We haven't even introduced ourselves. Everyone looked at him. The guy with the long nose is Usopp. Luffy began and pointed at Usopp. It's Captain Usopp. He announced. You mean vice captain when I'm asleep? Zoro reminded him with a smirk and he deflated somewhat. That cool looking reindeer is Chopper. Luffy announced and pointed at him. Bastard. I'm not happy even if you compliment me, jerk. Chopper replied while dancing his awkward little dance. Everyone's sweat dropped. That guy with green hair and scary face is Zoro. He said and pointed at Zoro. Shut up. He complained. That guy with the funny eyebrow is Sanji. Luffy announced and pointed at him. Honest-chan, I'm at your hey what did you say? Luffy ignored him while Zoro chuckled. They nearly started a fight but Robin broke them apart. The mean-looking redeed using the waiver is Nami. He said and pointed at the White Sea. Mean-looking? Everyone repeated. And the mysterious-looking girl is Robin. Luffy said and pointed at Robin. She quirked an eyebrow. Mysterious-looking, Captain San? She asked with a somewhat wide-eyed expression. He nodded. You're mysterious Robin. He replied. Kinda like those poneglyph stones you're searching for. Poneglyph? She corrected him. Right. He nodded. And I'm Luffy. He said with a big grin and pointed at himself. Kana smiled at their introductions. It's nice to meet you all. She told them and smiled. Kana-san. Robin began after a moment of silence. Could you perhaps tell us about the dials you've mentioned earlier? A few minutes and a basic explanation of dials later. Hey Kanis, Luffy began after listening to her explanations and seeing her demonstrations of dial use. She looked at him. A man attacked us down below on the White Sea. He said he was going to reject us. Does that have anything to do with dials? She looked down for a minute. There is a war going on here on Skypia. Well, nothing has happened for a while, but it soon will. She started. Her and her father's faces fell. There are 3 types of dials that are used almost exclusively for combat. Axe, impact and reject. She stopped for a moment. Axe dials are used for cutting your opponents, while impact deliver blunt force to the opponent. Reject is a stronger version of that dial. Kanis continued. Reject dials are said to be 10 times stronger than impact ones, but they harm the user. It's unlikely for a normal man to survive wielding a reject dial. Everyone's eyes widened. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. So then, it's unlikely he was actually going to use an actual reject dial? Sanji asked. That's right. Kanis replied. Even if he somehow found one, it's doubtful he would use it. A reject dial could be very useful in Marineford if it comes to it, Luffy thought. Then he raised his head in determination. Yosh, I've decided. He announced. I want a reject dial. Everyone looked at him in shock. Kanis and her father paled at his words. Why you can't be serious? Kanis stuttered. Didn't you just hear what I said? Luffy looked at her with a determined expression. But I'm rubber, blunt attacks can't hurt me. He told her. She looked at him oddly. I ate the gomu gomu no mi, one of the devil fruits. He told her after a moment. She looked surprised. And blunt damage means like a punch, right? Punches don't hurt me. I suppose that could work. Sanji spoke with a thoughtful expression. Well, Kanis began again. Even if it wouldn't harm you, there's still the matter of finding it. It's very rare. It's possible nobody has it. Luffy deflated somewhat, but after a moment he regained his smile. Well, maybe we'll get lucky. He announced. There was silence for a few moments. Hey, where is Nami-san? Sanji, who stood on the balcony, asked. Everyone looked at him oddly. Shouldn't she be using the waiver? Usopp asked. Father, will she be okay? Kanis asked. He put down his fork. Yes, Kanis-san. I also feel a bit unsettled. He replied. Why? Luffy asked. What's wrong? Kanis turned to him. Here on Skypia, there is a place you must never ever set foot on under any circumstances. She replied with a serious expression. Everyone looked at her. A place where you must never set foot on? Usopp asked. Why is that? It's sacred ground. Kanis told the. Sacred ground? Robin repeated. Kanis nodded. We call that place the land where God resides, Upper Yard. She told them. Luffy stood up. The place where God resides. He repeated. A place where we must never set foot on. She nodded. By God, do you mean the God? Chopper asked. God lives here. She nodded with a troubled expression. Luffy looked at his crew members and his eyes met Robin's. It seems they both noticed her change in demeanor. Yes, because Skypia is God's land. It's ruled by the Almighty God, NL. She replied. Almighty, eh? Luffy thought and smirked. Quite an ego problem you have there, NL. In the corner of his eyes he could see Zoro also smirking. God NL knows everything that goes on in this world. Kanis continued. He wondered if she actually believed it herself. Everything? Usopp asked. Everything. Kanis confirmed. What? Even right now? Chopper asked. He's watching us right now. Humph. God, eh? Zoro huffed with an unimpressed sounding voice. Zoro, you don't believe in God? Chopper asked. Zoro shrugged. Oh no. I don't care if he exists or not. He replied. It never mattered to me one bit. Not that I have anything against anyone that wants to believe. Have you seen this God, Kanis? Luffy asked. No, I've never seen him. Kanis replied, waving her hands in front of her face. We can't set foot on Upper Yard. Luffy suddenly walked up to the balcony. When he turned around, he had stars in his eyes. Is that so? He asked with a voice barely containing excitement. A place where we must never ever set foot on. Usopp cringed while Chopper looked at him in awe. Zoro and Robin seemed amused. Hey, Luffy. Usopp yelled and started shaking his cardigan. What are you thinking right now? Listen to what she's saying. Robin glanced at Kanis and her father, who surprisingly didn't seem to be offended one bit. They actually had resigned, somewhat solemn expressions. What is the punishment for entering? Robin asked after a few moments. You will not return alive, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. The father told them. The cowardly duo present cringed at this. It's sacrilege, so God will punish you. I'm sorry. How? Luffy asked. They looked at him bewildered. Excuse me? Kanis asked. Luffy looked at her with a thoughtful expression. How does God punish those who break his laws? Luffy asked. Then suddenly as she started to speak, he felt a familiar discharge of energy in the near distance and a man dying. Never mind. Luffy interrupted. Lightning, right. Everyone looked at him in surprise. Kanis and her father seemed shocked. How did you? She started. I just felt someone die on Upper Yard by lightning. Luffy interrupted. Felt? Kanis asked with a wide-eyed expression. You have mantra? Luffy nodded. The crew looked at them with surprised expressions. It's known as observation hockey on the Blue Sea. Luffy said after sensing their confusion. Never mind that. Sanji yelled. It wasn't Nami Swan, right? He said and gritted his teeth. Luffy shook his head. She hasn't entered Upper Yard. She's afraid though. She'll probably return here soon. He explained. Everyone sighed in relief. Wait. Zoro exclaimed. You can sense all the way up there? Luffy nodded. But observation hockey users have a long range of vision. Somewhere in the sky, NL smirked. Ihahaha. How interesting. He exclaimed. A mantra user from the Blue Sea. Would you like some apples, Kami-sama? An attractive woman asked and offered him a golden plate full of them. Oh, you are just too kind. Yahahaha. Supposed to be any waivers on the Blue Sea. If it was stolen, it would be class. We didn't steal it. Luffy interrupted. We found in a ship that fell from the White Sea. That's highly questionable. McKinley replied and sighed. But I guess it's possible. Then Luffy ran towards Usopp, who was trying to catch a fish with his fishing pole. This should be fun. Luffy thought and smirked. Usopp then seemed to have caught something. He tried to pull it, but it was too much for him. "A good catch, eh, Usopp?" Luffy commented and patted Usopp on the back. Usopp smiled and continued pulling. Luffy and Chopper joined to help him pull it up, but when they finally succeeded, the fish jumped out from the sea, freeing itself from the fishing pole. The fish headed straight for Kanis with its mouth wide open, the intention obvious. Kanis screamed in fear. Zoro jumped in the air and hit the fish with the back of his sword and then kicked it down into the ground. Everyone ran towards the fish and looked at it. "What is that?" Usopp questioned. "Another funky fish," Chopper answered. It was about to eat Kanis. "So this is another type of skyfish?" Zoro questioned. "Ah, excuse me." Pagaya interrupted their conversation. "Thank you for saving Kanis-san." "Father, that fish," Kanis began. Well, McKinley announced in a reprimanding tone. "This is a rare type of skyfish. Its capture is prohibited. You have violated the law protecting rare species. That a class 9 crime." Luffy smirked again. Robin noticed that. "How is that a crime?" Usopp asked. "It was attacking Kanis." McKinley laughed. "Zoro, did you finish it off?" Usopp asked. Zoro shook his head. "No, hit it with the back of the sword," he replied. Usopp sighed in relief. "Then if we release it, there's no harm done?" Usopp asked. He kicked the fish and it woke up and started moving its tail. "Yosh!" Luffy announced and drool started leaking from his mouth. He stretched over to the fish, getting Usopp out of the way. Then he opened his mouth wide. "There, you can't deny now that you were trying to eat it," McKinley announced, a bit too happily for everyone's tastes. But, contrary to everyone's expectations, Luffy blew some air at the bump on the head of the fish. He then turned around and looked confused at McKinley. Almost everyone freaked out because of Luffy's uncharacteristic behavior. As they did so, Luffy smirked smugly. "Is he mocking me?" McKinley thought. Robin also noticed his smirk. Was he planning this? She thought with widened eyes. Zoro, however, was less than pleased by the man's constant crime accusations. He gripped his katana. "Standing around listening to this guy go on and on about bullshit crimes is pissing me off." Zoro spoke in a low tone. "If he doesn't stop it." Usopp grabbed Zoro and restrained him. "Your behavior right now was quite threatening." McKinley began with a smirk. "Such behavior is deserving of Class 7 crime." "Sorry." Luffy interrupted with a smirk of his own. Everyone looked at him. "But you have no way of knowing what Zoro would have said. For all you know, he meant to say that he was going to slap you with a banana or give you a tissue." Every one of the crew stared wide-eyed at Luffy. He was gripping his weapon. McKinley defended. Luffy shook his head. "Zoro's white katana is from his friend," Luffy began. "He often touches it to make sure it's still there." But McKinley tried to say. "So you really have no reason to punish us." Luffy finished with a huge mocking grin. "We're still on Class 11. McKinley gritted his teeth in anger. Every straw hat eye that was present was bulged out. "How can Navigator-san and Cook-san possibly think this man is stupid?" Robin mused with a slightly parted mouth. "Ah, guys?" Luffy asked with a large grin as he turned around. "What did I say?" "Nothing." Everyone muttered while waving their hands in front of their faces. "Something's fishy here," Chopper yelled. "He's trying to make us look more guilty." Usopp nearly got a heart attack. "Chopper," he yelled at his friend. "Don't say things that'll make it worse." "But we can't do anything with them around," Chopper yelled. Usopp suddenly got a light bulb. "Anything?" he repeated. Then he punched his fist into his palm. "Then let's not do anything. Let's take a nap." Everyone except Robin laid on the ground and started snoring. Both their friends and the captain's sweat dropped. "Making such a contemptuous sound at the Serene Angel Beach." McKinley began once again. "You are guilty of environmental pollution. This is a Class 6 crime." "Boy, you can't even snore," Usopp yelled in disbelief. "These laws are ridiculous," Robin thought. Zoro gripped his katana. Usopp jumped in front of him to prevent him from attacking. "Yes, but..." Luffy began with another mocking smirk. "We weren't actually hurting or disrupting anything." "You were disrupting us," McKinley said and pointed at himself and their two hosts. "Kanis and her father didn't seem to mind us sleeping. Neither did their pet," Luffy replied with a smile. McKinley again gritted his teeth. "What about us?" he yelled and pointed at himself and the officers far behind. Luffy grinned. "You're enforcers. You haven't come here to relax," Luffy continued. McKinley's face reddened in anger. "You've come here to make us look guilty." Everyone looked at Luffy in shock. "Like I thought," Robin concluded in her thoughts. He knew all along. "Hey everyone." Sanji yelled from the nearby forest, carrying lots of melons in his hands. "What are you doing?" Oh, Sanji. Chopper started. Wait a minute. Nami yelled from the distance, interrupting them. Nami Swan. Sanji yelled with a heart in his eye. You're safe. Luffy, don't make these guys mad. She yelled as she approached them with a waver. Luffy rolled his eyes and sighed in irritation. He didn't reply though. Nami, use your money to pay the 7.000.000 berry illegal entrance fee. Usopp yelled. That's great. She replied. So this can be settled if we just pay a fine. Then her eyes darkened. 7.000.000 berry that's. She crashed into McKinley. Way too much. She yelled with shark teeth. Luffy face-palmed and Robin as well as Zoro chuckled at his reaction. What crime level are we now? Zoro asked Konis as Nami returned the waiver to her father. Class 5, obstruction of a public servant. Konis answered. Good, it's still only 5. Usopp sighed in relief. It's not good. She yelled. It's death sentence. What? After a few minutes. I'm telling you, Luffy. It's too dangerous. Nami said. Luffy just smirked and put a hand on her shoulder. City of Gold, Nami. He told her. But it's too dangerous. She yelled. A billion berry, Nami. He said. No, maybe not just a billion. Maybe billions. Her eyes turned into berry. Everyone's sweat dropped. Please run away. Konis yelled from the distance. Surrounding her and her father were the white berets. Hurry. That's enough, young lady. McKinley began. Know that if you aid these criminals, you could become one yourself. He smirked. For repeated abusive language towards us and the obstruction of a public servant, you are sentenced to cloud drifting. He announced. But I said it was an accident. Nami yelled. Zoro shook his head. Really, Nami? Couldn't you have reacted a bit less violently? He asked. She glared at him. You guys have nothing to talk about. She yelled. I bet you did all sorts of crimes while I was gone. Actually, Robin began. Nami looked at her with widened eyes. Captain San had the situation well under control until you came, Navigator San. What? She yelled and pointed at Luffy who seemed to be getting annoyed. Him? Yes, him, Navigator San. Robin confirmed. Nami sighed. So, this is all my fault? She asked. Yes. Everyone answered at the same time, except Sanji who didn't say anything. That's way too blunt. Nami yelled at them. Arrest them. McKinley yelled. The enforcers raised their bows and fired some unusual-looking arrows. Everyone somehow dodged those arrows, but it became clear that hitting them was not the real intention. The arrows created some sort of cloud paths in the air. The enforcers used the clouds in combination with their skate-like dial-powered footwear to gain an advantage. They each carried 2 blades. Luffy just sat down and let his Nakama deal with them, occasionally dodging a swipe aimed at him. A few minutes later. Luffy, Sanji and Usopp watched into the distance as the giant speedy crab took their ship and the rest of their Nakama with it. Luffy glanced at Konis who wore a guilty and sad expression. Honest Swan, you must be worried about us. Sanji announced cheerfully. That's so sweet of you. Konis smiled in relief. But are you guys going to be okay? Usopp asked. The people in town all avoided us, but you're lending us your boat. And you even told us the way. Isn't this going to make you look like an accomplice? Konis sweated. She had a troubled expression. You look pale. Luffy added. If you were scared, you could have stayed at home. She gulped. Everyone looked at the scene in shock. No. She said after a moment. She hesitated. It's not what you think. She looked at him. It did seem strange, didn't it? Politely telling you the route to the ordeals. Coming with you here. All while saying the ordeals are more fearsome than death. As if I was leading you here. You, stop. McKinley yelled. Don't say anything. People started backing away as far as they could, even though they were already a good distance away from her. Sanji looked at them. Could it be are they all in on this? He thought. He turned back to her. Luffy's gaze did not leave Konis. She bit her lip. She seemed both sad, scared and most of all regretful. Suddenly she fell on the ground, now trembling uncontrollably. Please get out of here. She yelled. She looked on the ground. I'm so sorry. She started crying. Stop. One of the onlookers yelled at her. What are you saying? Another shouted. I wish she started, but her words were muffled. Everyone looked in surprise as Luffy's outstretched hand covered her mouth. Everyone stared in bewilderment and shock at the Straw Hat Captain. I saw. He said simply. Konis's eyes widened in shock at the simple words. His 2 crew members looked at him in confusion. He let go of her mouth. McKinley and the other onlookers looked at him in complete shock. Then, you must hate me. She started. Don't be an idiot. Luffy interrupted her. She looked at his face in shock. You had no choice, right? Hey, what's Usopp began, but Sanji put a hand on his shoulder. Usopp looked at Sanji, who shook his head, preventing him from continuing. Honest nodded as more tears streamed down her face. Luffy crouched on the ground and to the surprise of everyone hugged her. "It's okay," he said to her. "I don't blame you." She nodded and looked on the ground. He stood up after a while and looked around. "I know you're listening, God." Luffy spoke, spitting out the last word like a curse. There was no need to involve Conus in such a way. In the shrine of God, high in the sky, NL smirked to himself. "We'd have went regardless." Luffy continued. "I think I'll enjoy your shitty little challenges. They might be fun." Luffy just used the word shitty. Usopp thought to himself. And why is he so eager to get us into trouble? I wonder what happened with Conus-chan. Sanji thought. McKinley, who stood behind the wall, shook his head. They're always this eager in the beginning. He thought. He saw Luffy smirked. "If you are God, Ine or whatever your name is," Luffy continued, saying the name wrong on purpose. Everyone cringed upon hearing the mistake. "Then what do you call a man who defeats a god? You have until I reach you to think that out." Everyone stared in complete and utter shock at Luffy. He smirked. Meanwhile at the god's shrine. NL stared at empty air for a few moments with a slightly shocked expression, but then he regained his arrogant smirk. "Ihahaha. What delicious insolence." NL yelled out. His hand was suddenly surrounded with electrical energy. "I'll show you the power of God, Straw Hat." He laughed some more. A few minutes later and an explanation later. "So which door will we choose?" Usopp asked as they stood before 4 entrances. Luffy looked at him oddly. What?" he asked. "We have iron, string, swamp and balls. Isn't the choice obvious?" Shishy. Luffy asked. "How is it obvious?" Sanji asked with a confused expression. "Yeah, I don't get it either, Luffy." Usopp asked. Luffy blinked a few times and sighed. "Look, we're all guys, right?" he asked. They looked at him oddly. "What does that have to do with anything?" Sanji asked. Luffy shook his head in apparent annoyance. "We all have Kintama." Luffy whined. Both of his crew members blinked a few times. Then they both face-palmed. "I really don't get your sense of logic, Captain." Sanji sighed. Usopp looked at Luffy. "Balls of gold. Really, Luffy?" he asked in an annoyed voice. Luffy shrugged. Shishy. I thought that's what everyone called them," he said. The two shook their heads. "Anyway, shithead," Sanji began. "Unless you have a better explanation for your choice, we're going to choose." No, Luffy yelled. They both looked at him in annoyance. "Balls sounds fun." Shishy. "Fun?" Sanji repeated. "How so?" "I don't think ordeals are supposed to be fun, Luffy," Usopp said in a deadpan expression. "Well, maybe we'll have to play a game where we have to choose the right ball. Or we'll have to make sure a ball doesn't hit the ground or it'll explode," he explained. Sanji gained a thoughtful expression. "Well, it's possible," he said after a moment of silence. Usopp sighed. "I don't think it'll be as fun as Luffy thinks," Usopp replied. "But I do think it sounds like the least dangerous. I mean, it's pretty easy to see how iron would be deadly." He cringed as he imagined a 100-ton weight falling on top of their little ship. "It's pretty obvious what swamp does." He imagined himself sinking. String doesn't sound too bad, but then again. He imagined himself trying to get across to the other side by only using a rope connected on both ends with only empty space beneath them. "Ball sounds okay, but that could be a trick," he finished. "Well, balls it is, then," Sanji announced and took their tiny little dial boat to the right. They entered the entrance and found themselves in a dark tunnel. Luffy smirked as he remembered something. It was dark, so they didn't see it. "You know, guys," he began. "This reminds me of something." They looked in his direction. What?" Usopp asked. Luffy grinned. "You know how there were 4 doors?" he asked with a grin. "Why yes," Usopp confirmed, getting a worse feeling every second. "One of them is a prize door and the rest are all losing ones," Luffy replied. "Huh, what the hell?" Usopp yelled. "Why are you saying that now? What if we chose wrong?" "Well," Luffy continued, pretending to think about it. "If we're wrong, we'll probably fall off the Sky Island." Shishy. "I'm not falling off anything," Usopp yelled with razor-sharp teeth. "You know, it's 10,000 meters from here to the Blue Sea. Do you know how many times life would flash before your eyes during that fall?" Luffy just laughed joyfully. "Enough of this dumb shit," Sanji announced. "There's no way th." And at that moment they fell. Luffy just grinned while the faces of the other two changed to ones of pure horror. "Ooh," Usopp yelled with bulged eyes. "This can't be happening." Luffy laughed like a maniac. After a moment, they hit the river on the bottom. For several moments, both Usopp and Sanji breathed like they were drowning moments ago. "We're alive," Sanji gasped out. Usopp was in the worst state. Her lay on the ship, crying comically. I thought, he mumbled. I thought for sure we were going to die. Shishi. That was too fun. Luffy shouted. We should do that again. Shishi. Nuo. Usopp yelled. Sanji kept kicking Luffy in the head. This is your fault. He yelled. It's all because of your dumbest story. Shishi. Were you scared, Sanji? Luffy asked. Sanji huffed. I wasn't scared. Sanji said in an unconvincing voice. I was startled. Shishi. Sanji was scared. Luffy yelled. Sanji kicked him angrily. I said I wasn't scared. He roared. Luffy laughed. I'll have to tell Zoro about this. Shishi. He continued. Don't you dare, I mean I wasn't scared. Sanji yelled and kicked him again. It's all your fault anyway. Shishi. Sorry Sanji, Luffy apologized insincerely. Sanji sighed and stepped over to the driver's seat and sat down. Anyway, what's all this? He asked as he looked around. There were white balls everywhere. Are you stupid, Sanji? Luffy yelled. Sanji gained a tick above his eye. It's balls. Balls. It's the ordeal of balls. I know that, shithead. Sanji yelled and barely prevented himself from standing up and kicking the rubber captain again. Anyway. He sighed as he continued. Those seem to be little balls of island cloud. Luffy laughed. Awesome. He said in an excited tone. They look like huge snowballs. This place is so weird. It's funny. Shishi. And the Milky Road is going up the trees. Sanji continued. Luffy scratched his head. But what's the ordeal here? He asked, although he already knew the answer. No idea. Sanji replied. It'd be great if nothing happened, but I doubt we'll be so lucky. Lucky? Luffy repeated. How would missing all the fun and excitement be lucky? Well, you have a point there. Sanji agreed. Usopp, who just recovered from his panic attack, shook his head. You guys aren't normal. Usopp whispered. Luffy looked at him oddly. You aren't normal, Usopp. He told him. Usopp looked at him with confusion. What do you mean? He asked him. Luffy sat down on the boat. Well, we're not afraid because we're really strong, right? He asked. Usopp nodded. Isn't that pretty normal? Usopp gained a thoughtful expression. I guess it is. He said after a while. But why am I the abnormal one? I'm scared. That's normal too. Luffy looked at him with a soft smile. Well, I for example aren't scared because I know that whatever happens, I probably won't die. Luffy continued. But you don't know that. And yet you're still here with us. But I run away all the time. Usopp told him honestly for once. Even though our friends are in danger, the only thing I wanted to do in Lovely Street was run away. Yes, you run away. Luffy told him. But then you stop. Usopp looked at him with a shocked expression. But, he started to say. It's much more brave to fight when you're afraid than when you aren't. Even if you do run away at first. Luffy told him with a grin. Luffy, Usopp whispered. Sanji, who was at the steering wheel, shook his head with a small smile of his own. Anyway, let's eat. Luffy announced. Wait a moment, Luffy. Sanji shouted. Then he sighed. And you're not eating. We're in enemy territory here. So keep a lookout. He continued driving the little boat towards the destination. Usopp, pass. Luffy said and threw him the little cloud ball lightly. His friend hit the ball back lightly. Luffy returned him the ball. Suddenly a snake appeared out of the ball and tried to bite Usopp, who barely dodged. Luffy punched the ball away. Shishi. Surprise balls. This is going to be fun. Luffy announced in an excited tone. I said to keep a lookout. Sanji yelled at them. But when he turned back to steering, a giant cloud ball appeared in front of him. Shitty balls. He yelled and stood up. It's golden balls, Sanji. Luffy whined. Sanji's eye twitched. Shut up. He yelled at him. He tried to kick the big ball away, but it only moved a little bit. Then it exploded right in his face. Huo. So, do you like my surprise balls? A high-pitched voice asked. Everyone looked up. On top of a big cloud ball sat a very round man with yellow glasses, red hair and a simple straw hat. Thank you for choosing my ordeal of balls. Huo. The man told them. Everyone's sweat dropped. Did that ball just speak? Luffy asked. Hey, that's rude. Bastard. I'll kick your ass. Luffy yelled at the enemy. Both of his crew members fell down in I'm style. Hey, round guy. Sanji yelled after a few moments. Nami-san and the others better be okay. Oh, the sacrifices? The man asked. No idea. Huo. But if they stay where they are, they'll die. If they move they'll also die. Hu. Why you shitty bastard? Sanji cursed. You should be more worried about yourselves. The priest continued. To be blunt, you'll have to defeat me before you can move ahead. He jumped down towards their little boat. Here he comes. Usopp yelled. Kick his ass, Luffy. Luffy however had a different idea. He plopped down on the ground. Oh, no. Usopp repeated with horror in his eyes. No, no, no. Come on, don't do this, Luffy. Sorry Usopp. Luffy apologized, sincerely this time. But you need the training. The priest was fast approaching. Yosh, Usopp. Sanji announced. We'll have to take care of this. Sanji knew that if Luffy bothered to apologize, this opponent had to be at least reasonably strong. He leaped in the air and prepared a kick. Collier Sanji announced. An upper kick using the right foot. The priest announced. He moved his body back to dodge the kick and moved his right palm right into Sanji's face. Impact. He announced and the dial, hidden in his glove activated. To Usopp's horror, Sanji was blown away into a big tree. Sanji. He yelled. You can't be seriously hurt from a weak punch like that. Oh, but it's not a punch. The priest announced. It's a little different from that. Who are you anyway? Luffy asked. Usopp turned around with a disbelieving face. Hey, Luffy. He yelled. Be a little more worried about Sanji. Sanji's strong. He's fine. Luffy told him. True to his word, Sanji stood up, muttering curses. So you're a priest? Sanji asked from beneath a tree. That's right. The round man replied. My name is Satori. I'm one of the priests who serve our almighty god, NL. I control the Earth of the Lost Forest. Lost Forest? Luffy repeated. The man looked at him arrogantly. Yes. He answered. That's the name of this forest. Ho, ho, huo. Why is it called Lost though? Usopp asked. The priest looked at him with an unsettling grin. Well Satori began and raised his hand. Impact. Usopp was sent flying. The priest then turned his attention to Luffy, who continued to sit. Ho, ho, huo. And now for you. He said and put his right palm right into Luffy's face. Aren't you going to resist? Did anyone ever tell you to restrain yourself when eating? Luffy asked casually. There was silence for a few moments. You're the last person who can say that, Luffy. Sanji yelled from beneath, though in earnest he barely fought off a smirk from Luffy's blunt but somewhat hypocritical remark. Oh, why is that? Luffy asked in confusion. Stop insulting me. Satori shouted. Impact. Luffy however jumped in the air, dodging the burst of the impact dial. Armament. Luffy murmured and his right arm blackened. He landed on the back of the boat. He's fast. Satori thought. I barely followed his movement. I'll ignore you if I want to, Bullery. Luffy said with a smirk. The priest's face twitched. That was completely wrong. He yelled. It's Satori. Whatever. Luffy mumbled and waved his left arm in dismissal. Why is his right hand black? The priest thought. The Straw Hat Pirate then pulled his right arm back. He's going to stretch. The priest thought. Gomu Gomu no pistol. Luffy announced and punched forward. The arm stretched forward, barely missing the priest by a millimeter. The fist hit one of the huge trees of the Lost Forest in its huge trunk. Luffy pulled his arm back and it quickly snapped back into original position. There was silence for a few moments and then to everyone's horror, the tree trunk cracked and the huge treetop fell down on the ground. All that from just one punch. The round priest thought in panic and horror. Gomu Gomu no Luffy announced. The priest turned his head. Luffy used his Soru and was already near him, ready to whip him away. He moved his right hand in Luffy's face. Impact. He announced, but to his surprise, Luffy wasn't blown away, only his head was. It snapped right back into position. Muchi. Luffy completed his attack name and Satori was sent flying into a tree. He didn't use any haki however. Sanji used this opportunity to act and he jumped into the air. He landed a kick straight in the enemy's enormous stomach. Satori spat out a bit of blood as he landed on the ground. Sanji attacked once again, but the priest quickly got up, avoiding the kick that was aimed for his head. Impact. He yelled and put his hand in Sanji's face, but at that moment, Usopp shot a gunpowder star straight at him, forcing him to move to avoid it. In doing so, he had to retract his hand, which meant the blast was wasted on thin air. Sanji smiled and prepared to kick again. Usopp prepared himself for battle as well. Luffy observed as Sanji's kick missed the priest by a millimeter and he got hit with a simple gunpowder star. His observation haki is decent and he's quite tough, but he's not really skilled. Luffy thought as Sanji's kick brushed the priest's side, causing him pain. His only way of attacking are his dials. He's forgotten about his surprise balls. He's barely concentrated enough to use his mantra now that he knows how strong I am. Impact. The priest yelled. Sanji was sent flying into the ground. Satori jumped at him, attempting to use his dial to finish him off, but he had to avoid gunpowder stars, rubber bands and various random objects from hitting him, so he didn't really have time to use his dial on Sanji. Irritated, Satori ran towards Usopp while dodging his attacks and getting hit by some. He's going to get to him. Luffy thought and unsheathed his sword. Just as he was about to slash, Sanji quickly got up and with a kick aimed for the priest's head, sent his foe flying away from Usopp. Luffy smiled proudly. The priest jumped back up. His yellow glasses were now broken and his hat had long since fallen off. He looked really nervous. He ran towards his foes. Sanji attempted a kick on his foe, but the priest barely dodged it. After that, however, he jumped toward Sanji, using his sheer weight to both damage and restrain the cook. As the cook lay on the ground, bloodied and restrained, attempting to get out of his opponent's grip, the priest moved his palm toward Sanji's face. AKAINAMI red, wave. Luffy announced and slashed from the right to the left with a Shita no Kanashimi, sending a compressed air cut towards him. The priest pushed his head down to dodge the blast, but Sanji headbutted him, sending his head back up. The air blast didn't seriously damage the priest, but it did cut most of his hair on top of his head. "Don't forget that I'm still here, round guy," Luffy announced from the boat on top of the Milky Road. "Be a good training dummy." Sanji looked at Satori, who was still on top of him and looked in Luffy's direction in what seemed like a completely panicked expression. Most of the hair no top of his hair was completely gone. The sight would have been comical for the cook had he not been restrained and nearly impacted a while ago by that same man. "Training?" Satori thought as he gritted his teeth in panic. "Is that all I am to him?" He released his previously iron grip from Sanji and upon feeling that, Sanji managed to free his right leg. He kicked the priest from the side and he went flying a short distance. Immediately upon stopping, he received a gunpowder star in his face. Finally he collapsed on the ground. Usopp sighed in relief, lowered his weapon and sat on the ground. Sanji picked himself up and stood up. "Damn fat bastard," he muttered. If he didn't have that mantra thing, this wouldn't have been nearly as hard. "Hey guys," Luffy yelled. They both looked up to him. He stretched both of his hands, grabbing each of them. He pulled them up, ignoring their panicked yelling. They prepared to hit the boat hard or even to fall off it upon arriving back, but none of that happened. Instead, Luffy slowed his stretching after they were close and then gently put them on the boat. They stared at him for a moment in surprise, but then just decided to just be thankful for the gentler than normal treatment. "Thanks, Luffy." Sanji begun, but Luffy cut him off with his hand. "I shouldn't have even forced you to fight him," Luffy said, obviously sorry. He looked on the ground. "He could have killed you." To his surprise, Sanji laughed. He lightly punched Luffy in the shoulder. Luffy looked up. "Don't be stupid, Captain," he told him. "I know how strong you are. I'll never be able to match up to you if you shelter me too much." Luffy smiled. "That must have been the impact dial," he told them. Sanji nodded. "That bastard would be nothing without those dials or observation haki," he told the captain. "I'm kinda ashamed of getting hurt this badly." Luffy nodded. "He even dodged sloppily," he added. "And kept losing control of his mantra." "You obviously scared him too much with that punch, Luffy," Usopp told him. Luffy scratched his head in embarrassment and laughed. Shishy. I guess I did," he replied. "I guess you don't exactly see that every day. Though did you really have to completely destroy that tree?" Sanji asked in a deadpan expression. Luffy pouted. "I might have overdone it," he replied. Both of his crew members sighed. "Hey, let's eat, guys," he told them. "Sure. The priest is down, so we might as well do that," Sanji replied. "But let's get this boat moving again first." Then he remembered something. "Luffy?" he called. Said captain turned his head and quirked an eyebrow. "Something strange happened when the priest had me pinned down." "What?" Luffy asked. "It's as if I saw into the future," the cook explained. Luffy's eyes widened in realization. "I saw the guy pound my head into the ground with that shitty dial." Luffy gained an enormous grin. "That's observation haki, Sanji," he told him with an excited tone. "It seems it's activated itself." "Thanks for helping, Chopper," he said. The knight shook his head. "I only did what I promised I would do if you called me," he replied. "And I'm afraid if you hadn't arrived, it'd be for nothing. You see, me and Pierre can't move anymore." Luffy's face changed to one of confusion and after that realization. "String," he muttered. He unsheathed his sword and in an action barely seen by those observing, released a compressed air blast, which cut the tiny strings which held Ganfall and his partner in place. The blast then continued towards the tress and cut a tree in half and then dispersed. The priest watched in horror as the giant treetop slid slightly off the tree trunk. Ganfall and Pierre flew and landed on the Going Merry, next to Chopper. The priest and his bird flew and landed on the stairs beneath it. "So, you're one of the priests?" Luffy asked after a moment of silence. The priest smirked. "That's right. My name is Shura, I'm the priest of the Ordeal of String," he answered. "I don't give a crap about your stupid name, stupid jerk," Luffy answered. The priest lost his smirk and scowled. Shura and his bird took off and flew towards him, lance at the ready. As the priest flew towards him, Luffy dodged the lance. "Armament," he muttered and infused his right fist with haki. It became shiny black, but after a moment, the air around the fist ignited as Luffy was still under the effect of Gear Second. The man and the bird flew past him and turned around. He noticed the flaming fist and stared at it in confusion. He flew towards Luffy again, but this time, when his lance was dodged once again, a fiery fist collided with his face. He was sent flying through several trees before he finally stopped in one. The bird, Fusa, looked around furiously and being unable to locate him started flying around in panic, searching for him. "Wow, so cool," Chopper yelled from ship. Luffy turned around and laughed sheepishly while scratching his head. Of course, he forgot all about his fiery hand. "Luffy, your hair is on fire," Chopper yelled in terror. "Oh, crap." Luffy yelled and deactivated both his haki armament and his Gear Second. He started turning around in place while trying to put his fire out with his hands. All three observers' sweat dropped. "Is this how it usually is on your ship?" Ganfall asked. "Yes," Chopper answered. Pierre shook his head. After a few moments of running around in a circle, Luffy accidentally fell off the branch that he was standing on and fell down into the lake or whatever it was. Several sky sharks opened their mouths in order to eat him. "Crap," Luffy yelled. Chopper gritted his teeth in panic while Ganfall mounted Pierre and they flew towards him in an attempt to intercept him. At that moment, Luffy did the only thing he possibly could, he started kicking. "What?" Chopper and Ganfall shouted in unison. Luffy opened his eyes and looked at their dropped jaws and astonished looking faces. He blinked a few times in confusion and then looked on the ground and there wasn't any. Finally, his jaw also dropped. "I'm standing on air," he yelled excited. "So cool." He then tried to take a step forward. Unfortunately, he had no idea how the entire thing worked, so he used a lot more force than necessary. Accidentally, he activated his Gear Second. Luffy only had time to think before he was blasted high in the sky. "I am it," he yelled as he disappeared from view. After a few moments, the Knight of the Sky landed back on the ship. "This is crazy," he said. "I can't believe what I'm seeing anymore." Chopper nodded. "I know what you mean," he replied. "Hey, are you a talking reindeer?" Ganfall asked after a few moments. You just noticed." Quite a bit away from the sacrificial platform, Robin, Zoro and Nami had just found something interesting. Before them was the other half of Montling Cricket's house back on Jaya. "What's that?" Nami asked. Robin gained a thoughtful expression. "That could be the sound of someone getting his skin separated from his body, Navigator-san," she replied calmly. Nami and Zoro cringed. "Stop saying such scary things, Robin," Nami yelled at her. Robin just giggled. "It's getting nearer," Zoro commented. "Maybe someone," Robin started. "Don't say anything," Nami yelled with razor-sharp teeth. Robin just laughed again. "Move it, guys." "That sounded like Luffy," Zoro suggested. And then something crashed into them. Zoro and Nami coughed because of the dust, and after the dust settled, a very interesting sight greeted them. "Hey guys," Luffy greeted as he lifted his head. "Am I disturbing something?" "I feel like I'm the one disturbing something," Nami muttered with a sigh. Luffy, you might want to, Zoro suggested. "Get off her." Luffy finally opened his eyes. He laid on top of Robin. His head was on her bosom. He looked down and saw her staring at him. Hi Robin," he muttered. "Didn't see you there." She continued to stare. "This is like super awkward, isn't it?" he asked. She nodded slowly. He stood up and helped her up as well. "At least you were comfy," Luffy muttered under his breath. Her eyes widened. "Excuse me?" she asked. Never mind," he replied and waved his hand as if hitting a fly. He inwardly face-palmed. Why did I have to say that aloud? "Anyway, look at this, Luffy," Zoro called, trying to defuse the awkwardness. He pointed to the half of the house. "Cool," he yelled. "So then, this upper yard island was like blasted into the sky by a knock-up stream or something?" Everyone quieted down and stared at him in astonishment. "Yes, actually," Robin said after a moment. What you said was our conclusion as well. This seems to be the other half of Cricket-sen's house. I think we should head back to the ship now. Zoro suggested. By the way, why are you here, Luffy? Luffy sighed. Well, I sensed Chopper was in danger, so I quickly went after him. He answered. Flashback. After dealing with the Round Priest, the three pirates continued on the Milky Road. After a while, Luffy sensed a powerful presence near Chopper. He also sensed fear. He jumped off the boat on the grass field filled with heads on spikes. Hey, what are you doing, Luffy? Usopp asked. Sanji also looked in his direction. Continue this way. He replied. I'm going ahead. But why? Sanji asked. Chopper's in trouble. Luffy explained. He dropped into his usual stance. Here second. He announced. He used his legs as pumps for blood. Steam surrounded him. What's that? Usopp asked. Why is there steam around you? No time to explain. Luffy answered and dashed ahead. When he was halfway there, Luffy was startled by something he did not expect. A voice. A childish-sounding voice. Captain, my captain. What's that? He thought. After a while, he dismissed it in favor of continuing on his way. Dear second, what's that? Nami asked. Luffy looked at her. It's a technique that makes me faster basically. He answered. Then he sighed. Anyway, when I reached the ship, the mast was gone and the ship looked even worse off than before. He continued. The ship was attacked by one of the priests. Sure or something. So I beat him up. And what was that voice you heard, Captain San? Robin asked. Luffy shook his head. Don't know. He replied. Oh, the Weird Knight was also there. He came to help Chopper, but he was in trouble when I reached him. So he held his part of the deal. Zoro replied. Luffy nodded. If it weren't for him, Chopper might have died. And the ship could have burned completely. He answered. Why did you come crashing down from the sky though? Nami asked. Luffy laughed. Shishi. It's kind of funny, really. He answered. Funny? All three of them asked. Shishi, well you see if I combine Gear Second and Haki armament, I burst into flames. Luffy started. Their eyes widened. That's kinda cool. Zoro commented with a smirk. I wish I could make my swords catch fire. A sword is cooler when on fire. Shishi. Right. Luffy agreed while Nami face-palmed. Anyway, then I accidentally scratched my hair with my hand still on fire. All three of them looked at him in shock. You're kidding, right? Nami asked. Luffy shook his head. Zoro face-palmed while Robin laughed. Okay, then I tried to put the fire out and I accidentally fell from the branch. I kinda panicked there, so I did the only thing I thought of. Luffy continued. Zoro nodded. You mean, you stretched and grabbed a branch or something? He asked. Luffy's eyes widened. Don't tell me, Zoro thought. Luffy punched his fist into his palm. Right. I could have done that. Nami and Zoro both fell down. Robin just stared at him in bewilderment. You forgot about stretching? She asked. Luffy put his hands behind his head and laughed sheepishly. Shishi, anyway. I started kicking and next thing I know I was standing on air. Luffy replied and grinned. Huh? Yeah, cool I know. Shishi. Luffy continued. But I didn't know how to use it well, so I kinda overdid it and then I crashed into Robin. So, this standing on air thing Zoro started. Can you do it now? Luffy shrugged. I could try. He replied. It's called Geppo, moonwalk by the way. Or so I hear. Wait, you can actually walk on air? Nami interrupted with a shocked expression. There's a technique like that. Luffy nodded. Sure. But only high-ranking marines and agents can do it. It's kinda hard for a normal guy to do it. He replied. There was silence for a moment. Oh, by the way, Sanji unlocked his observation haki. Luffy announced and grinned. Seriously? Nami asked. Luffy nodded joyfully. Damn shitty cook. Zoro muttered. Luffy laughed. Oh, Zoro, you're jealous? He asked. The first mate's face reddened. I'm not jealous. He yelled with razor-sharp teeth. He stomped angrily towards the forest. We need to get to the ship fast so I can continue my training. Shishi. Observation training by any chance? Luffy asked and grinned. Shut up. He yelled. Zoro, that's the wrong direction. Nami announced. He started walking in a different direction. Swordsman-san, that's also the wrong direction. Robin said in an amused tone. Luffy then randomly started laughing. What is it, Captain San? Robin asked. He looked at her. Zoro suddenly got a very bad feeling in his gut. Shishi, you know, maybe we should just leave navigation to Zoro. Luffy started. Everyone looked at him with confusion. Maybe, then we'll find One Piece by accident. What is it, Usopp? He asked. Did you hear someone speaking? The sniper looked at him oddly. What are you talking about? He asked in confusion. Luffy's eyes widened. I heard someone calling me. Luffy answered honestly. Third time now. Usopp shook his head. I haven't heard anything. He replied. But anyway, Luffy, it's kinda embarrassing, but… What is it, Usopp? He interrupted. See, could you? He started, but hesitated, earning an embarrassed blush. I need to take a leak. Luffy looked at him with a confused expression. Just go alone. Another voice interrupted with a yawn. You're not a kid anymore. Hey, I'm not scared at getting deeper in the scary forest at night, Usopp stuttered, obviously not hiding his fear well. Luffy's look softened. So you want me to come with you? He asked. Usopp nodded. Decide. Fine. He answered. But let me warn you that I'm hearing voices. Zoro snickered. What if one of those voices ordered Luffy to kill you? Zoro asked in a creepy tone as he turned around, bearing a maniacal grin. Luffy chuckled upon seeing Usopp cringe and pale. The sniper, however, interpreted Luffy's amusement as something else and flinched slightly as Luffy got near him. Oh, relax, Usopp. Luffy told him. I'm not going to listen to what some stupid voice is telling me. Usopp relaxed slightly, but flinched again as he looked back at Zoro, who still bore an unsettling grin. And you? He said to Zoro. Stop looking at Usopp like that. Your face is way too scary. Oh, Zoro whispered loudly as his grin turned into a scowl and he glared at Luffy. After a moment, he humphed and turned back to the small campfire. Usopp and Luffy made their way deeper into the forest when Usopp thought he heard something. He flinched. What's wrong, Usopp? Luffy asked. Usopp shook his head. Thought I heard something. He replied. Luffy nodded. He guessed it wasn't that odd to be scared in a place like this. Luffy wasn't scared right now, but from his childhood experiences with the wild, he could definitely understand why his friend was so unnerved. After all, Usopp wasn't as strong as his monstrous crew members, and this was no ordinary forest either. They kept walking. To his relief, Usopp found his presence comforting and wasn't flinching anymore, even though the forest, as any other, kept producing noises of its own. Captain, my captain, the voice announced again. He stopped. Didn't you hear that? He asked his friend. Hear what? Usopp asked back. Luffy shook his head and continued to walk, but then Usopp stopped him. He looked confused at Usopp, but in a second, he understood everything. It was the sound of a hammer. It sounded like someone pounded on something with his hammer. I hear it. He confirmed. That sounds like, Usopp whispered. I know. Luffy interrupted. He sighed. Listen, just take a piss now and we'll check that out after that. Usopp nodded. Stay here. He ordered with a stuttering voice. Luffy simply nodded. He turned around and looked over the trees. Captain, come here, Captain, I'm waiting for you, the voice asked again. The hammering continued. Could it be, Luffy thought, but shook his head after a while. It sounds different. It's not the same. Similar, but not the same. Usopp finished after a moment. I heard it again. Luffy announced. Usopp looked at him. How does it sound like? He asked as they continued towards the sounds. The voice? Luffy asked. Usopp nodded. It sounds like the voice of a child, he answered. Usopp paled at this. Why, you're not making that up, are you? He stuttered. This sounds like something from a horror story. Luffy laughed. Hey, don't laugh at me. He whispered loudly. It keeps calling me captain. Luffy told him. Usopp quirked a curious eyebrow. And inviting me to come closer. Usopp looked down on the ground. Luffy could see that Usopp was frightened. Don't worry. He said with a smile. Nothing bad will happen. But, Luffy. Usopp protested. This sounds like something straight from a horror story. Luffy snickered. Hey Usopp, he replied cheerfully. What do you think it is? A dead little girl that's come to kill us. Usopp paled even more, color leaving his face completely. Don't say that. He protested. Luffy looked at him with a quirked eyebrow. So I was right. He asked with a smirk, but then he looked at Usopp with a more serious expression. Look, not many things can harm a pirate crew as strong as ours. Luffy continued. And I'm pretty sure we could take on a little girl any day. There was silence for a few moments. The hammering grew louder, as did the voice. Captain. After a moment they found the ship. They were very near as the hammer was loud. It was coming from the ship. They looked at the ship and could not believe what they saw. Ghost. Usopp yelled and pointed at the small figure, which did look like a ghost. Even Luffy was unnerved by this. His friend hid behind him. The ghost-like figure turned around and showed its unclear white face. The only thing visible were the big eyes and the wide grin, very similar to his own. Mary? He asked himself. Could that be Mary? Luffy, it's a ghost. Usopp stuttered. I'm gonna talk to it. Luffy announced. Usopp paled. But, Luffy. He looks friendly. Luffy replied. Then he turned his head to Usopp, who was still behind him. Look, if you're scared then go back to Zoro. But. I'll be okay. Luffy interrupted and smiled. Usopp slowly let go of him and turned around. Then he ran back to the encampment. As soon as he saw Usopp leave, Luffy flung himself onto the ship. A small ghost figure turned around. Luffy was surprised to see that the figure looked no different up close as it did from afar. It was a man made of blinding white light. Luffy could only discern the most basic humanoid features. "Captain." The little man yelled in a childish voice and attempted to hug him, but his hands passed through Luffy. His grin faded in obvious disappointment at being unable to touch him. "Are you?" Luffy started. "I'm Mary." The ghost chirped out in a cheerful voice, regaining his smile. "But how can I hear your voice? How can I talk to you?" he asked. "Captain, you have the ability to hear the voice of things," the little man explained. He dropped the hammer on the ground. "Mary's voice sounds different," Luffy thought. "I am different," the man replied. Luffy stared at him wide-eyed. "What's wrong, my captain?" the ghost asked. "I just answered to you." But I didn't say anything," Luffy answered. The ghost tilted his head. "Yes you did," he answered. "But I didn't say anything. I only thought about it," Luffy yelled in disbelief. The ghost scratched his head with his hand. "Said, thought?" he asked. "What's the difference?" Luffy could only stare dumbly at the figure. After a moment, he recomposed himself. "You said you were different?" Luffy asked. "Different from when?" "Your previous life of course, Captain," the ghost announced in a cheerful voice like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Luffy's eyes went wide. How do you know about that?" he asked. "You're my captain," the ghost announced. "I know my captain." But how can you know these things?" Luffy nearly shouted. The little man scratched his head again. "Don't know," he announced after a minute. "I just know all my captain knows and what my friends know." Luffy's eyes widened again. "You know everything?" he asked with a disbelieving expression. "You know about Ace and the crew and everything that's happened?" "Yes," the ghost yelled. Luffy just stared at him. "But how?" he asked. "Don't know," the ghost interrupted. "Why are you different?" thought he asked after a moment. "You're less childish," the little man offered. Luffy shrugged but then nodded. "My captain is different, so I'm different," the ghost replied cheerfully. Luffy just blinked a few times. Then he suddenly realized something. If he could talk to Mary, then that meant. "I'm dying," the little ghost answered to his thoughts. Luffy was again startled both by the bluntness and the revelation itself. But how?" he asked with wide eyes. "I made sure to take care of half of the iron spears and I beat up Bellamy before he could do anything." "I'm dying," the little man repeated. "I wish I could go on adventures with you forever, but I can't." Luffy looked down. "I failed again. I thought I could prevent all my mistakes, but." "This is not something you could have prevented, Captain," the childish voice interrupted. Luffy looked up and a tear dropped down his cheek. "But if I was stronger, if I." "No," the ghost interrupted. "You couldn't have. It was meant this way." There was silence for a few moments. "You can't control everything, my captain," the ghost told him. "And you shouldn't try." "I'm sorry, Mary," he whispered. "You always knew this was going to happen," the ghost told him. "I could never reach the new world, let alone survive in it." Silence lingered for a few more moments. "How do I tell them?" he asked and looked down. "Just say the truth." In the morning, everyone was startled to find Luffy staring at a random direction. When he turned to them, everyone could see he had bloodshot eyes. When asked about it, he confirmed what Usopp had said about the ghost but refused to say what happened afterward. He didn't think it was wise for him to break the news about the ship in his current state. Speaking about the ship, the ghost had repaired it. Like last time. This was another startling but not unwelcome discovery for the crew. To their relief, the crew found that Luffy wasn't aggressive or very irritable like he usually was when he got no sleep. He was just gloomy. Sad. After an uncharacteristically quiet breakfast, the crew divided into two groups. The group that would take care of the ship, which included Usopp, Sanji and Nami, and the group that would look for gold, which was composed of Luffy, Zoro, Robin and Chopper. After a few basic instructions, Luffy felt that it was his job to add a few things. "Hey guys," he announced. "Listen up." Everyone looked at him. "If you meet this god guy," Luffy began. "Don't attack him, even if he provokes you." Everyone looked at him in confusion. "He's bound to be very powerful, so leave him to me," he concluded. Then he looked at Sanji. "Sanji, I'm counting on you to protect Nami and Usopp," he told him. Sanji nodded. "I'll make sure Nami Swan doesn't get hurt," he announced while doing his noodle dance. "And Usopp," Luffy added. "Whatever," Sanji replied. Luffy smirked. He knew that although Sanji was very rough and dismissive of his male crew members, he would still do whatever he could to help them. Plus, he seemed very protective of the long-nosed sniper. After going deeper into the forest and barely escaping the gigantic python, which he didn't really want to fight since he later learned that he was not such a bad guy, a snake, that he appeared to be, Luffy found himself alongside Robin as she searched for the ruins of the City of Gold, which was supposed to be somewhere on the upper yard. It was really the only place he could think of being. He knew that if went with either Chopper or Zoro, he'd likely be overprotective of them. He knew they had gotten very messed up by their respective opponents, and that would have prevented them from improving as much as they could. Still, however far away he was, he'd run to them if he thought they were in too much danger. Observation hockey and future knowledge were both a blessing and curse. He knew what was going to happen. He knew they were going to be fine, but still after seeing them all dead once, he couldn't help but be worried about them. He convinced himself to trust in their strength. They handled this before. They can do it again. Robin was searching for the ruins, but it was obvious that she wasn't that much into it at that very moment. He knew she had something to say. And he knew he wouldn't like it. And he was right. "Captain San?" she asked, but didn't turn around. "What is it, Robin?" he asked. "I know you're hiding something," she answered. His eyes widened. "Oh, crap," he thought. "You are impossibly powerful, Captain San. And you know things you couldn't possibly know," she continued. They stopped. After a moment she turned around and looked at him. He tilted his head on the side and looked at her with an expression as confused as he could muster. "What do you mean?" he asked her. She shook her head. "Don't try to fool me," she told him. "I'm not an idiot, Captain San." "I never said you were," he told her. "You look like you're 16. She started. "And yet you often act as the oldest of us." "I'm 17. He corrected her. "Not the point," she told him. "You're 17 and yet you can fight with Dracula Mihik on equal terms. You seem to know a lot about everywhere you go and yet you don't look like the learning type. You have nightmares about everyone dying on a regular basis." He looked at her. "So I'm hiding something?" he asked her. She nodded. He smirked. "From the moment I got you on crew, Robin, I knew you would be the hardest to keep things from," he told her. Her eyes widened. Then what she started. "But I can't tell you anything about it," he interrupted. "Not yet." She looked at him with a small smirk. "That makes me even more interested in your past, Captain San," she asked him. He sighed. He looked her in the eyes and she flinched. Flashback. She laid on the ground. She was still alive, but it was obvious she didn't have much longer. She laid in her own blood. Her arms were burnt. She obviously tried to use them to at least somewhat restrain the murderous admiral. "Luffy," she whispered, unable to raise her voice. "Robin," he answered with tears in his eyes. "There's still time, I can." "No," she interrupted. "I'm sorry. I won't be alive much longer." He stayed silent, respecting her unspoken wish. "Thank you, Luffy," she told him. "Thank you for saving me when I wanted to die." She smiled. "It was the best thing that anyone had ever done for me." The tear slipped from his eye. She noticed that and her expression softened. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Death," he answered and looked away. "That's what happened. Everyone died." They continued their search in silence. "All memories?" "Nah," he answered. "I always think about that anyway." She quirked an eyebrow, but they were interrupted from any further conversation by footsteps approaching them. My, what a lovely young lady," a voice announced. Both of them turned around. Behind them stood a mountain of a man. He had long black hair as well as several chins, which Luffy immediately noticed. "Are you another one of God's servants?" she asked. He seemed offended by this as he took a threatening step forward. "Shut that insolent mouth of yours," he threatened in a reprimanding tone. "I'm the chief enforcer in the service of God NL. My name is Yama." "And what do you want here, Chief Enforcer-san?" she asked in a non-offensive tone. "You'll see soon enough," he yelled out with an evil smirk. "Mia." Luffy's sweat dropped while Robin just stared at him. Several birds flew away from the nearby trees. Seriously, Luffy thought, but then he smirked. "So, will you tell us what you want, Mountain Stomach?" Luffy chirped out in a cheerful voice. Robin looked at him in bewilderment. "Has anyone ever told you that you are way too blunt?" she asked. Luffy just grinned. "Oh, yes," he answered. "Plenty of times." She just shook her head with a slight smile. The head enforcer was less than pleased, however. "You'll pay for those insolent words, boy," he yelled and jumped in the air. He was surprisingly fast and agile for such an obese man. "Drop Mountain," the obese man announced, and as the name of the technique suggested, dropped straight at Luffy. The Straw Hat Pirate quickly took a thumb of his right hand in his mouth and bit it. "You're third," he announced and blew air into his hand and it inflated in size. After enlarging it, Luffy simply grabbed the fast-approaching mountain man and restrained him with it. "Hey!" Yama yelled from the fist, squirming in his grip. "Let me go." Luffy turned to his companion. "I figured you wouldn't be too happy if he destroyed the ruins," he told her. "Where should I put him down?" Robin blinked a few times and then pointed into the distance away from the ruins. They made their way in that direction. After they left the ruins, Luffy turned to Robin. "What should I do with him?" he asked her. Both of them looked at the squirming Yama in his hand. "I wonder how long it would take to clean the blood off your hand if you squeezed him to death?" she asked in a totally emotionless tone. His eyes bulged out. "Seriously, Robin?" Luffy yelled at her. "That's just yucky." She just chuckled at his expression. Luffy pouted and set the obese man down on the ground. Yama panted for a minute and then looked angrily at Luffy, who was undisturbed by his glare. "Now apologize to Robin for trying to hump her ruins," Luffy ordered in a childish voice. Robin laughed behind him. The chief enforcer fumed angrily in front of him. "Drop mountain!" he yelled and jumped in the air, attempting to drop straight on Luffy. The pirate moved out of the way however, and when he jumped the third time, arms sprouted from the nearby tree and grabbed him. After that, the combined power of many arms slammed the man into the tree trunk in front of him and he slid down on the ground. After a few minutes of bone breaking, slamming and dropping, the chief enforcer was dealt with. Luffy didn't interfere, although he thought that if he did, it'd be way less painful for the obese man. "Ah, it's so good to be rubber." Robin and Luffy then found a big ruined building with stairs leading to the top. Robin seemed very excited upon finding it and ran ahead while Luffy followed behind her. She cleared the island cloud which prevented passage to the lower levels. When they reached the lower levels and exited them they realized they had reached Shandora, the city of gold. Except there was no gold anywhere in sight. Meanwhile, Chopper had defeated the priest named Jidatsu and climbed the giant beanstalk also known as Giant Jack. Upon arriving there however, he was quickly disposed of by the remaining priest, Ohm. After a while, Zoro, Wiper, Ganfall as well as numerous foot soldiers from both of the warring sides also arrived on the scene and a three-way battle between Zoro, Wiper and Ohm commenced. Wiper as well as Ohm were hostile to everyone present except their own soldiers. Zoro focused on Ohm but was forced to fight Wiper as well, while Ganfall tried to fight Ohm until he was swallowed by another newcomer on the scene, the giant snake Nola, not that anyone actually knew her name. After a hard and destructive battle, Zoro had defeated Ohm. Wiper prepared to fight him, while Nola kept harassing all of them, being no doubt the most powerful being on that battlefield. As Robin and Luffy explored the ruins, the crackling of electricity interrupted them. Luffy immediately noticed the new presence. The self-proclaimed god Enel sat on a nearby ruin. He was luxuriously dressed with bits of gold and jewelry decorating his body. Luffy was intrigued by the drums attached to his back as well as his horrifically long earlobes. He smirked and took a bite of his apple. This finally snapped Robin out of her thoughts. "Yahahaha. Magnificent, isn't it?" he announced in his arrogant voice. "Even after being shot into the sky, the great ancient city still exists in all its grandeur. Shandora. But even a city of legend cannot display its splendor when it's obstructed by clouds." He took another bite. "I discovered it. My idiotic predecessors never even found it," he continued. Robin now turned around to face him. "And you are?" she asked. "I think that's pretty clear, Robin," Luffy told her quietly. The man on the ruin smirked. "I am God," he replied simply. He took another large bite from the apple. "Both of you have impressed me." He looked at Robin. "You have managed to find the city so incredibly quickly," he told her. "A task that took us many months to complete. I see that they are simple to find if you can just read the inscriptions." Then he looked at Luffy. "And you," he told him. "You managed to defeat one of the powerful priests with just one punch. Of course that means nothing against the power of God, but I commend you on your strength regardless. What I don't understand is why you came with her instead of helping your Nakama fight." Luffy smirked. "It's simple, really," he answered. "If I protect them too much, they'll stay in my shadow. They must fight their own battles so that they'll become as strong as me someday." "An impressive answer," Enel commended. "So this is mere training for your lackeys?" Luffy nodded. "Essentially yes. Except they're not lackeys," he replied. "Whatever you think of them, you needn't have bothered coming here. The gold you so desire is no longer here. You're a few years too late for that," Enel told him. "Gold?" Robin interjected. "Now that you mention it, there isn't any. So it was you who took it?" "Ihahaha. That's how it should be, isn't it?" he asked them as he ate the rest of the apple. "After all, whom better befits such an illustrious metal than God himself?" Luffy scowled. "This guy is getting on my nerves," he thought. "God this, God that, oh, I'm so goddamn godly." Then may I assume you also took the golden bell? Robin inquired after a few moments. This surprised the man slightly. Golden bell? He asked her. He doesn't know about it, she thought. This is very interesting. He continued. What did you learn by reading those glyphs? No, unfortunately, if it wasn't here when you arrived, then it never made it to the sky. Robin answered. It's here. Luffy interrupted. Both of them looked at him. It must be here. If it wasn't, Cricket Asen would probably have found it. Not necessarily. Robin started. No, he's right. The self-proclaimed god interrupted her. When this land arrived into the sky 400 years ago, a bell could be heard ringing throughout the land. So it's definitely here. He paused for a moment. The elders of this land called it the Song of the Island. He continued. So that bell was made of gold. That's splendid. There was silence for a few moments. That's splendid. NL repeated. Yahahaha. I suggest we search for it while we wait. Yahahaha. He laughed for a while, but after a few moments, his amusement was replaced by an annoyed expression. I hear a maggot on the edge of the island. He murmured. Luffy looked at him in confusion. I can't actually hear people's conversations. The best I can do is sense strong emotion and intent. He thought. Is this guy's observation hockey actually stronger than mine, or is it because of his devil fruit? After a while his eyes darkened and he gained a scowl. His body also started crackling with electrical energy. He stood up from the ruin and raised his hand. What are you? Robin yelled. Electricity continued to build in NL's left hand and soon it shot upwards. Almost at the same moment, Luffy sensed a strong discharge of energy somewhere on the island. What followed it was a strong sense of sadness and despair from a familiar aura. He gritted his teeth in anger. His right hand blackened. What was that? Robin asked in a panicked voice. NL's body stopped crackling with energy and he dropped his arm. He smirked. Mercy? He answered in his arrogant voice. I extended a hand of salvation to a maggot writhing in pain and set us free. Isn't that what God does? It seems the girl is still running about, but that's not really important. It's time for everyone to learn of the celebration after all. They will all know despair. Robin looked nervously at the self-proclaimed god. This man possesses a Loja type of devil fruit, she thought. She glanced at Luffy, who kept glaring at his enemy. Now then. NL interrupted her thoughts. It's time to finish this, isn't it? We're running short on time. The final plan is ready to be executed. Final plan? Robin repeated. The god simply smirked again and raised his free hand. It's time. He yelled. Appear before me, lowly mortals. Sango. A strong blast of electrical energy was shot upwards and hit the island cloud around the beanstalk above. The place crumbled and pieces of the island cloud as well as ruins started falling from the sky. NL simply grinned as the ones above panicked as they were falling. I have sent an invitation for your nakama to come to Shandora. Yahahaha. The god wannabe announced. This man's ability, Robin said as she watched with widened eyes the carnage above. What terrifying power. She then glanced at Luffy, who kept his eyes on NL. It was obvious that he was still mad, but his fist was no longer hockey infused. He seems calm, she thought. Is he not even unnerved by this display of power? They ran out of the way as the ruins crashed down, along with the people and the giant snake. As the snake flew down, several people emerged from its open mouth. The Knight of the Sky along with his partner and after that Nami with the small girl, named Isa, on a waiver. What's she doing here? Luffy thought as he saw Nami crashing into the ground. Near him, someone lifted a giant stone with his hand and threw it away from himself. Both Luffy and Robin looked at the man, who happened to be Zoro. Swordsman-san. Robin yelled. Couldn't breathe. Zoro complained. Luffy snickered. Did you fall down with the ruins? She asked him. Damn it. He cursed. I almost died. Robin's sweat dropped. You know, most people would have. She told him. You know, Zoro, I think I got an idea for my next battle entrance. Shushi. He told them. Robin looked at him with widened eyes. You're going to fall from the sky? She asked him in disbelief. He nodded. Shushi. Should be fun. He replied. Zoro nearly fell down because of his answer. Ow, ow, ow. Another girlish voice announced. Everyone looked in the direction of the voice. Nami stood up from the ground and headed towards them while massaging her rear. The knight, Ganful, followed her and after him the small Shandian girl. Since when is falling from the sky fun, Luffy? She asked as she glared at him. He simply laughed. If you're rubber it is. He told her. She simply shook her head. By the way, is Chopper okay, Zoro? He asked after a few moments. The first mate set the doctor down on the ground and checked his pulse. He's fine. He replied after a while. But he's pretty beaten up. Luffy nodded and turned to Nami. Take care of Chopper, Nami. He told her. She simply nodded and took him in her hands. "By the way, where are we?" she asked. Robin looked at her. "City of Gold," she told her. Nami looked angrily at Luffy. "Where's the gold?" she seethed, though her tone lacked her usual venom, no doubt from the tiredness. "Luffy, you promised." "It's not my fault, Nami," Luffy replied. "God took it." "God?" she repeated fearfully. "He's here." Luffy pointed at the said man, who simply sat on a ball of island cloud and observed them. He looked in her direction and she shrieked and hid behind Luffy. Between the straw hats, the warrior wiper, the only remaining Shandian, stood. He looked around in disbelief, clearly not expecting to find the lost city of Shandora so suddenly. "Is this our home?" he asked aloud. "Shandora?" The snake was also looking around, having lost its aggressiveness for the moment. After a few moments it did what nobody had expected it to do. It actually started crying. NL punished it for its foolishness by blasting it with electricity. NL then proceeded to mock the remaining Shandian warrior, telling him that everything was just a game. "The game?" the warrior repeated with disgust. "Yes, game." the god replied with a mocking smirk. "An innocent little game. And those behind you are the contestants." He looked behind him and the others approached to stand alongside him. He scowled at their arrival, but didn't do anything. Nami held Chopper and hid behind a wall, pulling Isa with her despite her protests. "I welcome you, spirited survivors," NL announced arrogantly. "I commend you for making it this far." He was amused by their glaring expressions and laughed. "Yahahaha. What is it?" he asked mockingly. "I just had a little fun. 3 hours from when this began, there will only remain a handful of the 80 people who entered. It was the survival game." Luffy smirked as he remembered that most of those fighting actually survived it, except they were knocked out for a long time afterward. "It included myself," he continued, interrupting Luffy's thoughts. "Some joined afterward, but I've included them as well. I participated. There would be 5 survivors, but it seems there are 3 more." The fact that Nami and Isa were hiding behind a ruin didn't escape his notice. "So what will you do? Will you choose amongst yourselves or should I be the one to choose?" he asked. This of course didn't amuse any of the ones present. NL looked at each of them and smirked in amusement. He obviously didn't really believe they would accept his offer. They all announced that he should be the only one to go and pointed their weapon of choice at him. Except for Luffy, who just sort of stood there. "And you?" NL asked mockingly as he looked at him. "Won't you make me disappear? I think a practical example on how to deal with annoying jerks like you is in order," he announced and smirked. The god seemed amused by his attitude and laughed. "Your insolence is amusing, but not very healthy," he replied and turned around. Ignoring their defiance, he then proceeded to explain his plans to them and what he had done so far. Of course, this enraged them further, and the former god, Ganfall, finally snapped after being told of how the current god dealt with his former subordinates. He ran forward towards NL with his lance to impale his enemy, but the self-proclaimed god simply laughed, threw his golden staff in the air, and motioned to his chest invitingly. When the lance ran through him, his body simply reformed back and he prepared to blast the former god with electricity, but Luffy quickly pushed the man into the ground. Everyone, including both of gods, looked at Luffy, whose arm simply snapped back into position. "Oh, this is surprising." "Yahahaha." NL laughed. "Why are you protecting this hopeless old man? What's he to you? He is not one of your nakama." Luffy smirked. "Maybe not, but he is a friend," he replied. "And he helped Chopper." "You Ganfall," whispered from the ground. "Meh, it doesn't matter anymore," NL announced. "The preordained time has come to pass and there are still too many survivors. How could God have been wrong?" He looked at the 4 people who stood against him, looking at the face of each one of them separately. "Yahahaha. Regardless. Will you now accompany me to the world of dreams, survivors? To Fairyverse?" he asked. "I'm feeling generous, so you may all join me." He looked on the ground where Ganfall laid. "Even you, former god, Ganfall." "Yahahaha," he told him. Ganfall clenched his fist in anger. "Idna," he began. "What if we refused?" Robin interrupted. NL looked at her oddly. "Why would refuse?" "I decided that," he replied. "If you remain here, you'll fall into the abyss along with this land." "You could do that with your power," Robin began. "But if you meaninglessly destroy this land, then the object which you seek will also be destroyed." "The golden bell, right?" he asked with an amused smirk. "Yahahaha. You don't need to worry about that. I've traced your steps and I now know there's only one place where it could still be. I believe we have the same conclusion, don't we?" His face then lost its amusement. "How unexpected," he growled. "You thought you could fool God with this kind of information?" His right hand began surging with energy. He lifted it and pointed his index finger at her and at its tip, the electrical energy concentrated itself. I hate manipulative women. He murmured. Robin looked in horror as lighting traveled towards her, but at the last minute someone jumped in front of her, taking the blast. Luffy? She screamed. She backed away slightly and shielded herself from the power. When the lightning ceased, everyone looked at Luffy. NL gaped at him in disbelief, and the same was with the others. He turned around and looked at the astonished Robin. He smiled. You called me Luffy. He told her and grinned. She blinked a few times. Hey, are you okay? She stuttered. He narrowed his eyes. Are you okay, who? He asked. Are you okay or not, Captain San? She asked. He pouted. You were supposed to say Luffy. He whined. I don't think this is the best time for this, Luffy. She told him. He grinned and turned around to face his gaping enemy once again. How are you okay after that, Luffy? Zoro asked. He laughed. Shishishi, well I'm rubber. He announced. The Straw Hats got a look of understanding. I don't know what this rubber is, but nothing surpasses lighting. NL yelled. Luffy turned around once again and looked at his first mate. Zoro. He told him. He looked him in the eyes and then quickly glanced with his eyes in the distance. Got it? Zoro whispered. He grabbed Robin by her hand and dragged her away from the scene. Then when he passed Nami, he grabbed her as well and they all got a short distance away from him and NL. Luffy then looked at Wiper. I suggest you also get away from here. He told him. The man glared at him, but then sighed. If you think you can beat him, then knock yourself out. He seethed. But after NL is gone, I'll settle things with you Blue Sea Dwellers. Upon hearing this Luffy was the one to sigh. I have no grudge with you. He replied. Wiper growled. You're here on our land. He yelled. You're looking to take what is ours. Luffy started. As entertaining as your little chats have been, I've grown a bit tired of them. NL announced and directed his palm at them. Thor. He roared and a massive electric blast headed towards them. Luffy inflated his stomach to cover more ground and shield the other man. As the lightning ceased, Luffy's stomach returned to normal and he turned around to the other man who stared in shock. Why did you protect me? He asked. Luffy grinned. If I hadn't, then his attack would have hit you. He replied cheerfully. The Shandian stared at him for a few moments, shook his head and then ran away from them. Luffy once again turned to face the self-proclaimed god. He glanced at the knight who lay on the ground with NL's foot on him. I need to first get him away from the weird old man. He thought. Then his eyes glanced to NL's face and he nearly freaked out. What looked at him was an expression that clearly did not suit NL. His eyes were as wide as they possibly could have been, his jaw was close to the ground and snot was running from his nose. Luffy smirked. So I guess this is what Giant Asen means when he says snot-nosed brat. Med reluctant to attack. He knew the man before him had an immunity to his lightning powers. After a moment, said man smirked and pulled his right hand back. Gomu Gomu no he announced and ran towards him. NL shook his head repeatedly. Calm down, he thought to himself. Even if he is immune to my power, physical attacks won't affect my body. Pistol. Luffy completed and delivered a heavy punch into his gut. It wasn't hockey infused, but it still connected with the lightning body. NL was blasted away from the old man underneath him and crashed into a ruin. Luffy helped the old man get back to his feet. How did you manage to hit him? Ganful asked in astonishment. Luffy grinned. I'm rubber. He replied cheerfully. Ganful looked at him in confusion, but then shook his head and headed toward the rest of the observers. Hey, how can he hit NL? Wiper asked Zoro. Does he have Kairosek stone on him or what? Zoro shook his head. He doesn't. He replied and smirked. He's just rubber. Wiper looked at him in confusion. What's this rubber you keep talking about? He asked. Robin looked at him. It's surprising that you don't know about it. She replied. But basically, rubber is a substance which doesn't conduct electricity. So lightning can't harm Luffy. They looked back at the battle scene where NL had finally gotten up. Don't get conceited. He yelled and charged towards Luffy with his golden staff. If I see that something won't work, then I'll just change my strategy. He attempted to smack his head with the staff, but Luffy ducked. Then he attempted to hit him into the ground, but Luffy jumped up in the air. NL smirked and smacked upwards, hitting Luffy straight into the crotch. All the observers winced and Zoro unconsciously shielded his crotch with his free hand. NL truly is a devil. Ganful commented with one of his eyes closed. It seemed as if for one moment he could feel Luffy's pain. You said it, old man. Zoro agreed, wearing a similar expression. Luffy was sent flying into air by the strong hit and after a while he stopped by kicking the air. I wonder if Captain Sen will be still able to have children after this one. Robin commented in an emotionless tone. You damn woman. Zoro growled. She chuckled. It isn't funny. It hurts like hell. For once I agree with Zoro. Nami said with widened eyes. It did look painful. Luffy landed on the ground. Despite being hit where he seemed unaffected. He was rubber after all. He glared at NL. Scratching another man's balls is kinda well, gay. He thought to himself. NL ran towards him with his staff and smacked down on him, but Luffy sidestepped it. The self-proclaimed god then lifted his staff and smacked with it sideways, attempting to hit Luffy's head. The staff was blocked by Luffy's right hand. NL then raised his left hand, which was free at the time, and pointed the palm at Luffy. Thor! He yelled, and a huge electric blast was released from his palm straight into Luffy, who stayed at the spot. By now, NL knew that lightning wouldn't hurt Luffy, but that was not his intention. The electrical discharge sent Luffy tumbling backward, but he quickly regained his position. However, that was NL's intention. The self-proclaimed god was already at him and had raised his staff with both hands and smacked Luffy across the head, sending him flying into the distance. However, he didn't stop there. Just as the pirate was about to crash into a ruin, he appeared above him using his lightning-fast speed and hit him into the ground. Nami, who was among the observers, looked at Zoro with uncertainty, but he just smirked, so she didn't say anything. NL jumped backwards, away from Luffy. He thought he had at least damaged his opponent somewhat. He did not really expect to have defeated Luffy with those hits, but he did think that he would at least have trouble standing up or would be a bit bloodied. What he did not expect was for Luffy to simply jump back into a standing position without the slightest sign of any damage. Sure, he looked dirtied and his clothes were a little charred because of the lightning, but he looked perfectly fine. That won't work either. Luffy smirked. NL's eyes widened. Lightning won't work. He muttered. Physical attacks won't work. Just what is rubber? He sighed. No, wait. He's a simple paramecia. I've already seen what he can do. He continued quietly, believing Luffy doesn't hear him. The pirate smirked. Along with observation hockey, his hearing has improved tremendously. After all, the first step to mastering observation is often to train your senses. NL laughed. If I can't harm you with a staff, then I'll use something else. The self-proclaimed god announced pompously. Lightning surrounded the golden staff. Loam paddling. He announced, and the staff changed its shape into a trident. I have no time to play with the likes of you. NL yelled and charged at Luffy, who dodged the trident. Yahahaha. As I thought, you are vulnerable to piercing attacks. He announced with his arrogant voice. Yeah. Luffy confirmed. Nami face-palmed after hearing that. Idiot. She yelled with razor-sharp teeth. Don't tell him that. Zoro chuckled. Relax, Nami. He told her. It's not like he can take on Luffy. Luffy continued to dodge the trident for a few moments, and then when he finally got tired of dodging, he pulled back both of his arms and prepared to attack. Gomu Gomu no Bazooka. Luffy yelled as his arm snapped into the front to execute his most powerful normal attack. The self-proclaimed god moved back with the power of lighting and successfully dodged the blow. Luffy smirked. He relaxed his posture somewhat, leaving his arms hanging. So, what do you call a man who defeats a god? He asked and grinned. His opponent gritted his teeth in anger and lunged forward, barely missing Luffy with his sharp weapon. There is no such man. He yelled in anger. Luffy pulled back his right fist. Armament. He murmured and the fist blackened. He punched forward, but NL turned into lightning, avoided the punch and appeared behind him. God can't be defeated by a mere man, much less a simple paramecia. NL smirked arrogantly and stabbed forward with his trident. Luffy raised his right foot and kicked the air beneath it. In doing so, he still used too much force and accidentally sent himself flying into the air, but he stopped himself by turning around and kicking the air above him with his outstretched right leg. Again, he used an inappropriate amount of force since he still had very little idea on how much was required. He was sent flying toward the ruins. Just as he was about to crash, he grabbed hold of one of the larger ruined buildings and stopped himself. He twisted his body around in a way that would be unnatural to anyone but him and threw himself in NL's direction. The Loja appeared before him in the air with the trident pointed in his direction, expecting Luffy to impale himself. He instead kicked the air underneath him, and with that he flung himself above NL, preventing himself from getting into contact with the weapon. NL turned into lightning and appeared above him and stabbed underneath, but Luffy dodged and grabbed the trident from the side, raised it in the air together with NL, and threw them both into the ground. NL did not crash into ground, as he turned into lightning a moment before doing so. He was back at Luffy again. The rubber man stretched his right leg sideways and whipped NL from the right with it. The Loja spat out blood as he finally stopped himself in the air. He glared at Luffy, who motioned for him to come get him with a smirk. He lunged toward his opponent with his trident. Luffy again sidestepped the weapon, but then punched forward with right hand. The self-proclaimed god turned into lightning and moved backward, but while he was able to avoid most of the damage, he still got hit. He reformed back into his body and spat out more blood. Zoro smirked as he watched from the ruins. That lighting bastard has no chance against Luffy. He thought. He can barely even keep up with him. How can this battle be happening? Ganful asked as he saw Luffy stop himself from falling by kicking the air, which sent him accidentally crashing towards NL, who had just recomposed himself from the hit. How is he fighting in the air? Captain San has become capable of using an air-walking technique. Robin replied, causing him to look at her in astonishment. After a moment they turned back to the battle, where Luffy avoided getting hit by the trident by kicking the air, though he again used a lot more leg force than necessary, so it sent him crashing into the nearest giant tree. She sweat dropped. Though he isn't very good at it. She added after a moment. He nodded a few times. Back at the battlefield, NL appeared behind Luffy, who was trying to free his head from the tree trunk. He stabbed forward with his trident and Luffy used his observation haki to dodge the stab. Because NL also used observation however, he anticipated the dodge, so he struck differently. What happened then was that Luffy was stabbed on the side with one of the trident's teeth. He managed to avoid the worst however. His opponent removed the trident from his body and prepared to strike him again, but Luffy hardened his head with armament haki and pulled it out and struck NL in the chest with his Gomu Gomu no backwards bell or something of the sort. NL crashed down into the ruins and Luffy turned around and jumped after him. After a few moments NL rose up again, though this time he had some trouble. He spat out more blood. Yahahaha. I got you. He announced arrogantly, like he had already won with that single stab. He pointed at Luffy. Oh, that? Luffy asked as he lifted the fabric of his cardigan on his left side, revealing a nasty-looking wound from which blood flowed freely. The three Straw Hats winced upon seeing this. Nami covered her mouth with her hand in shock. Don't think you've won by giving me such a small wound. Luffy continued mockingly. I barely even feel that. Small wound he says, Nami muttered in disbelief. If you're God, then shouldn't you have killed me by now? Luffy asked and smirked. Instead you brag about getting one hit in. He took a step forward. I'm still standing. He added. NL gritted his teeth and attacked again. This time, Luffy dodged the attempted stab again, but then gripped the golden weapon with his right hand and stretched back his left arm and armored it. Gomu Gomu no pistol. He announced and punched forward. NL concentrated too much on getting the trident from Luffy's hand, so when he noticed what Luffy was about to do, he had no time to avoid the punch. Subsequently, he was sent flying. Without his weapon. Luffy looked at the golden trident and smirked. Nice stick. He commented. I think I'll keep it. By now, NL was struggling to even stand. He spat out more blood and clutched his chest. Viper watched in disbelief. Just how powerful is this man? He thought. All the warriors who have encountered NL so far have been defeated effortlessly, including Kamakiri, and yet. You don't think this is over, I insolent am mortal. NL growled. He seemed to have trouble speaking. Luffy laughed. No, it isn't. He replied. He threw the trident back to his enemy, which caused half of the observers to freak out. Most notably perhaps, Nami. Why did you do that? She shouted from the behind him. Zoro shook his head. It's honor. He told her. He is allowing NL to fight with his chosen weapon. She sighed and face-palmed in irritation. NL caught the weapon and then lightning surrounded it. Blown paddling. He announced. Everyone looked at the god in anticipation of what he was about to do. The weapon turned back into a staff and everyone blinked in confusion. Then the lightning surrounded it again and after a moment, he somehow started shooting tiny bits of gold from it at Luffy. Luffy dodged the approaching bits of gold that shot towards him with super speed, intended to pierce his body. Luffy kept swaying left and right, easily dodging most of them. A few pierced his clothes, but none of them could hit him. How is he doing that? Nami asked in shock. It seems that's what mastering observation haki means. Zoro replied, however he was shocked as well by Luffy's display. After a few moments of dodging, Luffy decided that it was enough. He activated his Soro and lunged forward, twisting and stretching his arm behind him. Armament. Gomu Gomu no, he announced. A gold bullet brushed his shoulder, but he ignored it. Rifle. He completed the attack name and struck NL in the chest with a powerful technique. His foe collapsed on the ground. That is the end, so thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.